question of what's the cause? What is the foreign agency that's causing all of our problems as Canadians? Because there is, we agree, a foreign agency that has infiltrated Canada, is compromising our future, has been gaslighting us for a long time, that our politicians are complicit in, a deep state complex is complicit in. But what is that foreign entity, right? Is it something that emanates out of a state, a nation state, using conventional Cold War terminology and narrative tropes that, or is it something bigger? Is it something that I postulate is more tied to a supranational entity that is very ancient and that has penetrated itself into the various governments of the world and has worked to build up parallel states within different civilizational groupings? And I think that today's presentation, especially for us here in Canada, is going to be useful. And I want people to also keep in mind that anything that I say, because in a debate format, you can't really develop in detail a lot of bigger ideas. So if there were things that were said that you'd like to see expounded upon about why China itself as a state is not the cause of our problems, it's not really, there's something much higher that wants to destroy the Chinese civilization as much as it wants to destroy Americans, Canadians, Russians, and the associated civilizational systems associated with these different groupings, then feel free to ask those in the Q&A period, and I'm sure we'll get somewhere. I want to just, I want to just thank the Holmes family as well for just sparking Cynthia and I have been coming here to Alberta now for some time, speaking of Freedom Groups, and it was through the invitation of that incredible family that we began doing this, and we've really fallen in love with the entire paddle here. And this is where life is happening. There's nothing really in Canada except here in Alberta where you can really find a sign that there's a desire to figure things out, to work things through, and take responsibility for the future. So, God bless.
Ontario?
Was that?
Not even in Ontario.
Promethean, Ontario.
We have it in Saskatchewan, it's just a lot smaller.
That's true. It's nice. Yeah, I spoke at the event that you were at, right? That there is something going on there too.
Yes.
For sure. And I think that that's the key, is that there's a people need role models in order to just function in life, and there hasn't been a lot of Canadian role models. So what is happening here in Alberta by the creation of a process through which leadership can emerge is inspiring other people to think of themselves in a bigger way than they formerly thought they were capable of. And that's the good thing about crises, is it forces people to look inward and to activate potentials that they didn't even think in times of stability were part of them, right? And that's the story of Canada in many ways too, because in Canada, we have been given a story about where we come from, what we are, which I would attest, when you scratch on that narrative that we've been given in our history books, is largely bunk. Not entirely, but mostly bunk. And that story, to the degree that we hold to it, or believe it to be true, our potential of what we can do is going to be unnecessarily limited. And as I've noticed here, I've chosen to call this the British origins of Canada's deep state. And I did this work in 2012 to 2013, and this research project is what manifested in the Canadian Patriot Review that I began around that time. This is the first iteration of these discoveries, was published in volume 4, 5, and 6 of the Canadian Patriot magazine. And the thing that got me on this was I was politically organizing. I was an organizer, a volunteer for an organization that was an American organization affiliated with the American economist Lyndon LaRouche. And it was a small little office in Canada. And it was very charming. There are very potent ideas, I guess I could say, which, as a conspiracy theorist, would become quite black-pilled looking at the evil Freemasonic agencies. And I spent a couple of years just looking at how much we've been screwed with by occult agencies, manipulating mankind from above. I was quite demoralized about the idea that, okay, this thing called the New World Order, it's been around, the plan has been around since before I was born. I guess it's just a matter of waiting it out and trying to survive the coming storm, right? That's where I was at. It wasn't a healthy psychological state to be in. And then I discovered it in my hunt for solutions that there was this organization that had also been around longer than I had been born, affiliated with the old man LaRouche, which had an action plan and policies that I saw met the needs of humanity. I didn't believe it was possible to do it, but I saw that it was viable, it had historic precedence, and it dealt with the imminent collapse of the banking system. This is 2006. That LaRouche was already then talking about the fact that our entire economy is built upon unpayable rates of debt and derivatives bubbles upon bubbles that were only waiting to be blown up. And that was something that I could understand when it was explained to me. And the remedy then of breaking up the banks, doing things that were already done in the 1930s, like Glass-Steagall, became very common sense. Like, we did this in Canada, we did this in the United States. They had a version in Europe coming out of the Great Depression when we had a better caliber of culture that didn't tolerate the concept of mass population reduction and fascism as the solution to those remedies, as many Wall Street and London bankers would have preferred to be the case. So one aspect of that, and we began organizing politically in Ottawa, we went down to the US, but one thing that troubled me was that within the LaRouche's analysis, and the analysis we were bringing about revising our understanding of our history, was that the City of London never disappeared, but was still an active agency representing an invisible British Empire that still exerted a vast control over the US. And the very deep state, the thing that, it wasn't called the deep state at the time, that terminology came about in around 2016. But at the time, that shadow government complex was actually British in pedigree, although it used American ruling families, it used American institutions, skull and bones, but it actually had a British quality to it. And that was very provocative. And especially for somebody living in a British Commonwealth, I was like, well, how does that affect Canada? We do have a crown, right? We do have a governor general, lieutenant governors, a privy council. We have all of these things, but nobody here in the organization that I joined knew how to think about that. So myself and a few people were kind of bothered by the same problems. We collaborated and we began to just sort of pick on a few anomalies. Like, why was it that the Club of Rome seemed to have originated in Canada in 1970? Why was it that Maurice Strong, who was the father of the structural adjustment systems that were then utilized by the IMF and the World Bank to enslave small countries that had suffered under generations of colonialism, why was it Maurice Strong that created the Canadian International Development Agency? Why was he a guy who also groomed Trudeau, set up the Canadian Club of Rome? Why was that brought into this new World Economic Forum in 1973 with their models that were premised around the idea that we could, as responsible leaders, organize our planning for the future around reducing overpopulation before it becomes a problem? And that was something that was done. So what's the bigger story behind that? And in the course of that research, the fact that this Canadian deep state is British in pedigree, it's not Chinese, it's not Russian, it's not Venezuelan, it's not Iranian, it's specifically British. And I don't mean, of course, the British people, became more and more clear. Now, this is something for those who haven't really looked through the books that have been published, and a lot of that research has been compiled in those books at the back table that'll be available at the end of today's presentation. And I want to, before really jumping into it, hold a simple principle in mind. Because at the end of the day, it's like, what are we using to analyze, to break through the complexity and the mess of narratives that are preventing us from understanding how we got here and what we do? One of the simple principles is to, first of all, just recognize that we have not nations on the world. That's a fiction. We do have sovereign nations, but we have battles between authentic representatives of cultural groups and this oligarchical apparatus that's been around since ancient Babylon. And it has maintained different iterations, but has continuity of families, of institutions, of methodologies. And one of the methodologies that this oligarchy that's latched on like parasite always wants is control, right? Stasis, control. And what do you do when you have a lot of people? Well, a lot of people who live well, who are smart, are hard to control. They don't accept adapting like animals to systems that will destroy their children's lives. They will think through problems and solve them and organize. So you want to whether it's the days of the old Roman imperial rule of its satraps, or earlier Babylon, or the Persian controls of its satraps after Babylon, you'll find that the idea of depopulation, population control, keeping the human beings as dumb as possible, as hedonistic as possible, so that they don't actually know what the joys of the mind or the spirit are, and instead are confused to think that the joy and pleasure that we have should only be reduced to whatever's like below the belt, and that's it, right? Food and sex and everything associated. That's happiness and that's pleasure. But the idea of the pleasure of the mind, of discoveries, of the joy of teaching, all those things should not be something accessible to the slave class. Inversely, also divide to conquer, because doing that, people get they don't just adapt to that unnatural state very easily, so you gotta keep them divided, both with their neighbors, right? You gotta, ideally, keeping people tribal works, getting people to only talk to people who already think or look or sound like them, so that way it's more easy to create stories about the other that is useful to dehumanize other tribal groups that, if you want to create wars, that you have to do that first, so that people don't think they're killing other humans that are equal to them. They're killing maybe something subhuman, right? So these are all little basic principles of imperial management of humanity, bad ideas. One of the things that empires also despise, well, not also, is the idea of, when they lose control, things like this happen. And this is something we've probably all seen in school. It's basically a growth of European population, specifically from the 400 BC period to 1975. I should have gotten it correctly, but it was a last minute decision to slip this in here. And this is something I know a lot of younger people, my little cousins who have encountered the population demographic charts in school, usually are told, this is a sign that we're a cancer. This is why human beings are overpopulated, why we're just going to kill Mother Gaia at some point, so that should horrify a young, impressionable mind if it's framed to them in that sick, misanthropic way. Inversely, I would say from a healthy human standpoint, that graph featuring basically a relatively stable, slowly growing population demographic, from the 400 BC period to around the Middle Ages, then something happens around the 13th century to the 14th century, this little collapse. It's called the Black Death, So there's a period of war and pandemics. A century, the 100 Years' War occurs around that period, and then things begin to pick up again. And something happens around the 1500s, whereby this complete change in the rate of change is seen, at least quantitatively, where we're now at 8 billion people. I would say that that's a sign that you're doing something good. That's a sign that you're doing something right. Because it's not only that the quantity is growing, but also you have the population density growing, the ability of people that you can sustain as a society in a smaller area, but at a higher quality of life, so that your life expectancy is also increasing proportionally. So the quality, as well as the quantity, is both increasing to be fruitful and to multiply, right? Not just multiply, but to be fruitful and multiply. So if you just get multiplication, then overpopulation becomes an issue. But if you're getting better, smarter, having better technologies, making new discoveries, then overpopulation is no longer an issue. Right? You're always increasing the potential of what we can support. And that should be, I would say, like a discovery kids are encouraged to make in grade 1, maybe kindergarten. Right? It's not a hard concept, right? But even today, university educated economists don't have an easy time grasping how that factors into economic theory, macro or micro. And that's a big crisis that we have conceptually. But it's something that the oligarchy has paid a lot of attention to, the science of how human beings overcome their limits to growth by making discoveries of God's creation and translating that into new technologies that allow us to have those effects. It used to be not so misunderstood, and when you read the writings of Abraham Lincoln and his economic advisors, you actually find that was very well understood. And one of his leading economic advisors was a fellow named Governor William Gilpin, the first governor of Colorado Territory, who commissioned this map based upon a first-tier series of engineering feasibility studies to help people. In 1890, he commissioned this map. He wanted humanity, the patriots of the world, to imagine how we could break humanity free of this infantile slavishness to empire that we've been held back from, or that's been holding us back for millennia. And his book is beautiful. It's called The Cosmopolitan Railway, and as he calls it there, it's the economic, just, and correct map of the world with Pacific focus. And, he was a part of the entire program to build the Transcontinental Railway from the get-go of the 1840s all the way till the Transcontinental that was launched by Lincoln in 1863 during the Civil War. That was always Gilpin, who was a key player organizing the building of this program. And all the way to the point that the Russians came in, saved the United States from the Civil War that the British had helped organize. And then even sold Alaska, Russian Alaska, to the Americans. The idea was to always extend that rail line through the Bering Strait into the broader Eurasian world. And that was something in discussions by Lincoln's admirers and collaborators around Tsar Alexander II, another assassinated Tsar. Sergei Witte, Alexander III, Nicholas II had even invited whole teams of American engineers and paid $6 million for those American engineers in 1904 to go and carry out feasibility studies, of which they concluded it would be about $300 million to do the actual project. In those terms, those days, that's probably like what? I don't know, $1 trillion, but it was still deemed to be economically viable. Gilpin, in his book, is outlining how wealth is about not what you have, but about what you can create. How can you arrange what you have in order to generate something that will make the future better for your kids? And he wasn't alone. So that idea was not just a fringe theory, that it was something that had weight, and a lot of people in Canada were fans of it as well, especially many people in British Columbia at the time, an isolated colony, were very much a fan of the idea of working with the Americans to extend that railway all the way up to New Alaska, New American Alaska. And something got in the way. So, to begin the process of why these natural developments didn't manifest, because I do see Canadian history as a series of aborted attempts to become something real. That's the way I've come to.
That's a t-shirt.
Yeah. Mental note, let's do that. But so each one of those aborted attempts, when you look at it, is a lesson for what we can do today, because we are living in history. People coming after us are going to look back at this moment as an exercise to see, were we fools, were we wise, did we live up to the occasion or not? And in Canada's history, whether it's the war of the rejection of Benjamin Franklin's offer to join the US in 1776, or the failure to do what Mackenzie King and Papineau were challenging us to do in 1837 and 38, or the case of the offers of the Lincoln Patriots in Canada to try to get Canada to become a republic. We failed. We failed to accept those challenges. We have these lessons that can be learned. Who did the sabotaging? Who were the great minds that maybe have been written out of our history or slandered? And how can we reappreciate what they did, in many cases gave their lives for, in order to resituate where we are now? So Alfred Milner is a guy who's going to come to the story in a special way. I'll just read a quote from this very powerful representative of the British Empire in 1909, when he came down at a moment of British Empire crisis, when the empire was losing its grip of Canada. And he writes, he's looking at three possibilities for the future of the British Empire's control of Canada and what Canada would be. He says, as between the three possibilities of the future, number one, closer imperial union, number two, union with the USA, and number three, independence. I believe definitely that number two is the real danger, which is union with the USA. I do not think the Canadians themselves are aware of it. They are wonderfully immature in political reflection on big issues, and hardly realize how powerful the influences are. On the other hand, I see little danger in the ultimate imperial unity in Canadian nationalism. On the contrary, I think the very same sentiment makes a great many, especially of the younger Canadians, vigorously and even bumptiously assertive of their independence, proud and boastful of the greatness of their future, of their country, and so forth, would lend themselves, tactfully handled, to an enthusiastic acceptance of imperial unity on the basis of partner states. So that's interesting, right? Because you got a guy here who is the head of a secret society, which we're going to look into a little bit, that was set up by the British Empire in the wake of the Empire's own Vietnam War, which is a brutal bloodbath, a ritual murder campaign that went on for several years in South Africa called Boer Wars. And there's a grouping called the Milner Kindergarten that emerged out of that atrocity, where literally the war was won and the Boers were destroyed, because the war was basically Milner and his little what's called Milner Kindergarten, young Oxford sociopaths, realized that it were better to take the war to the children and the women of the Boers and the Transvaal fighters instead of actually trying to deal with these guerrilla warfare tactics. And that's where they innovated the concentration camp system. So that's what Hitler was actually studying when he was looking at how it was that other nations were able to subdue savages and what have you. So he's looking, okay, let's maybe concentration camps that work for them. Let's do it ourselves now in Germany. And it was successful at the end of the day, getting the empire to keep a strategic maritime chokehold in the Cape of Hope, or the Cape of Good Hope, Cape around the South African tip. But also it created a base of operations that went on to influence things in the 20th century that are very disturbing. But all to say that the society that he was a part of was labeled by this guy here named Wilfrid Laurier, our prime minister from the 1890s until 1911. And Wilfrid Laurier was a Lincoln-admiring Republican who miraculously gained federal power against all odds. He was actually part of the Papineau networks fighting to create a republic in Quebec during the US Civil War. And when that failed, when Confederation happened that he fought against, but Confederation did still happen, keeping us loyal to the crown, he ended up taking a different strategy and decided to try to infiltrate and work with the system from within, and he made it pretty far. Usually that doesn't work. That being said, he still got Canada. He still got coup d'etat. So you could say it worked, but with a big, Now what did he do? He envisioned a Canada with 60 million people by 1940. That was his vision. An electrified Canada with rail stretching and connecting everything east and also north and south. And he also was looking at like-minded Republican thinkers who were followers of Lincoln and McKinley in the United States that he had been negotiating with to get a collaboration. Now, one of the things that, the way he was doing this, he spent 10 years building up and planning to get this active union, this not active union, it was a reciprocity agreement to create a customs union of the United States and Canada that would together have an internal free trade process and an external protective tariff, but not free trade like NAFTA. It wasn't like ideologically free trade or monetarist. It was based upon the idea that we would facilitate trade within the continent based upon an industrial policy that back then was still much more popular than it became in our consumer society, go nowhere day and age. That was something that he was very happy to see almost manifest when the House of Commons and the Senate both passed the legislation, and right before he could pass it into law, he got canned by a coup d'etat organized by the Freemasonic Orange Order of Toronto, which at that time had 1 in every 3 adult males as initiated members of the Orange Order, the Orangemen, as well as this roundtable group that was coordinating all of it. That was the Milner Roundtable group. I'm going to say more about that. And he said in 1914, after he was ousted and Canada was getting sucked into World War I, that the British also orchestrated as an artificial war of attrition and destruction of their enemies. He wrote to his ally, Odie Skelton, who later on became Minister of External Affairs. He wrote, "Canada is now governed by a junta sitting in London known as the Round Table, with ramifications in Toronto, in Winnipeg, in Victoria, with Tories and Brits receiving their ideas from London and insidiously forcing them onto their respective parties." That's a big statement. And the Tories and the Brits, that's the name they were using back in those days for the Conservatives and the Liberals. I would say that didn't change it for me. Just because of order? Oh, he's a good guy.
Fantastic guy.
Oh, yeah. Oh, well, they do that with Ben Franklin too, right? So that way, when you see Ben Franklin, you're just thinking about money, think about Benjamins, and you're not thinking about what he did to the Great Revolution, right? So, yeah. So what is the Roundtable, right? So here are some of the key figures who founded this thing. It was basically a think tank / secret society built up in 1902, but it took a few years. It had a few incarnations before that, designed to preserve a dying British Empire, which at the turn of the century, people were waking up all over the world to the evil of what this thing was. The empire had exerted a massive amount of influence, trying to destroy Russia with the Crimean War, India with the massive famines, the Bengal famines, the uprisings in India in 1860 was a major embarrassment for the British. That took them a lot of effort to put down those massive uprisings, killed 2 million Indian patriots who were trying to break free at that time. China had suffered their own opium wars and civil war while the US was also fighting their own civil war, organized also by the same British Empire, called the Taiping Heavenly Kingdom Rebellion. 30 million people basically got together under a new messiah figure who had been organized by British Jesuits who convinced this guy that he is the brother of Jesus reincarnated and should institute the new heavenly kingdom that went on for about 7 years of internal battle while the Chinese were fighting the Opium Wars against the British at the same time. So everyone was kind of realizing at the same time that the British Empire are a problem. Okay? And so the empire needed a bit of a rebranding. Their civil service wasn't disciplined enough to maintain and carry out the type of genocides and famines that were being expected of them to maintain population control, as was the case in India, with controlled famines to keep the populations down, the pressures high. And these figures, basically, you have here, Lord Nathan Rothschild was one of the money bags behind it. John Ruskin was one of the ideological founders of this thing, who trained Cecil Rhodes and Milner in Oxford in order to configure a more religious aspect of the empire. They were saying the problem is our people don't think of the empire and the English-speaking civilization, English-speaking peoples as enough of a religious thing. It's too much of a practical utilitarian thing. And so he said we need to create this new devoted knighthood that would be able to be organized as a disciplined warrior class that would then be the new civil service, the new managers, to infiltrate and then co-opt nations from abroad. And that's why they named it the Roundtable, is that it was an homage to the Arthurian Grail Knight legends, the Lucidian mystery plays that were revamped under the chivalric orders that recruited basically useful, disposable men in the Crusades to become cannon fodder for higher level lords and princes and Norman feudal barons that needed their private armies to then go be sent off to kill and be killed for their benefit. Now the Roundtable, so that idea of the knighthoods that used the Arthurian Roundtable mythos as a way to get people into a romantic warrior spirit in the Crusade period was what they were also inspired to do in their new Crusading period for Crusade for the British Empire. That guy here, W.P. Steed, was an intimate of Madame Blavatsky, one of the key backers of both the Roundtable as a propagandist, but also as a promoter of supernatural, mediumship and astrology that was being also groomed at that time to be sent into various governing classes to start training elites of different parts of the world on how to make decisions based upon what the spirits tell them through mediumship. That's what Mackenzie King got sucked into around that same time, by the way, when he started going to John E. Rockefeller's personal medium to get told what types of policies he should set up for Canada, and whether he should, align with the British, go to war, make peace, do austerity. He would always ask his dead mother and dead dog.
Dead dog.
Dead dog. That was actually one of his advisors.
Dogs spoke English.
It was mind to mind, right? So there's a network. Also, like I said, this guy was tied to the Theosophists and became a big promoter of the esoteric section of the Theosophists and the Hermetic Order of the Golden Dawn as sort of a new discipline. Not even that discipline, honestly, but it's more like a new religious engineering institution of the empire. The empire can't just control people physically or just mentally. You got to also get them spiritually. And all the Roundtable tried to bring together all of those needs in one place. There's a guy named Carroll Quigley. Who has not heard of Carroll Quigley, the researcher from Georgetown? Everyone's heard of Carroll Quigley, almost everybody, except me. This guy is an interesting figure who understood the Roundtable movement quite a bit. He wrote a big fat tome called Tragedy and Hope. It's a hard read, but there's useful things in it. There's a smaller book that he only wanted published after he was dead, and when you read the book, you start realizing why. It's called The Anglo-American Establishment. I'm going to read it. It's a quotey thing, but it's all true, so I'm going to read it because it's useful. He's describing here the Rhodes-Milner group, the Roundtable, and he says what it did, its influence. Just quick one, right? This was published in 1980. He says, this organization has been able to conceal its existence quite successfully. Many of its most influential members, satisfied to possess the reality rather than the appearance of power, are unknown even to close students of British history. This is the more surprising when we learn that one of the chief methods by which this group works has been through propaganda. It plotted the Jameson raid of 1895. That's what set the stage for the Boer Wars. It caused the Boer War. It set up the control of the Rhodes Trust. That's the Cecil Rhodes fortune that was used by Cecil Rhodes to provide for the funding of a new movement of ideological mercenaries that would be given scholarships to be brainwashed in Oxford and then sent back to respective parts of the Commonwealth as Rhodes Scholars to then service the infiltration and continuity of this empire. Also, that would be managed with a series of think tanks that his Rhodes Trust would fund, which included the CFR, the Council on Foreign Relations in America, and we'll say more about what those are because they're in Canada too. He says here it created the Union of South Africa in 1906 to 1910. It established the South African periodical, The State, in 1908. It founded the British Empire periodical, The Roundtable, in 1910, and this remains the mouthpiece of this group. It has been the most powerful single influence in the All Souls, Balliol, and New Colleges of Oxford for more than a generation. It has controlled the Times for more than 50 years, with the exception of 3 years. It publicized the idea of and the name British Commonwealth of Nations in the period of 1908 to 1918. It was the chief influence in Lloyd George's war administration in 1917 to 1919, and dominated the British delegation to the Peace Conference of 1919, which, by the way, Lloyd George was brought in as a British-run coup steered by Milner, who became Minister of the Commonwealth, or of the colonies, during that time of World War I, and it was under that control that him and the other members of the Roundtable who managed Lloyd George was a direct part of this, were able to organize the basis of the Versailles Debt Treaty, the Paris Agreements, everything else were all organized. The thing that created the League of Nations was all organized by this particular group here, which had assets controlling and steering the very soft-minded, senile Woodrow Wilson in the United States. It had a great deal to do with the formation and management of the League of Nations and the system of mandates. That's the Mandate of Palestine that later on was used to create the State of Israel. It founded the Royal Institute for International Affairs in 1919 and still controls it. That's otherwise known as Chatham House. It was one of the chief influences on the British policy towards Ireland, Palestine, and India in the period of 1917 to 45. I would say today. It was a very important influence on the policy of appeasement of Germany during the years of 1920 to 40, and it controlled and still controls, to a very considerable extent, the sources of the writing of the history of British imperial and foreign policy since the Boer War. That is a lot of influence for a think tank.
It's the same Anglo-American that just bought control of the Christendom.
Yes.
Wow, there you go.
Yeah, Anglo-American. Yeah, there's a number. De Beers, Lonnerho were also created by Cecil Rhodes. In fact, also the Standard Bank, which merged with Charter and is a major drug bank, was a South African bank that Cecil Rhodes had created as well to keep control of the British, which also back even in those days included drug money laundering and basically drug production. So these are not new techniques that we're just seeing applied to us in our modern day. These are old techniques that have been spun and weaved and honed for a long time. By the way, that Standard Chartered Bank I just mentioned is also one of on the foreign enemies list in China because they still managed to control the Hong Kong money with HSBC, another drug bank that Britain created, that together controlled 2/3 of the Hong Kong money supply for some reason. But they're still on the enemies list, and China's been fighting them back against these things that were used to destroy them for well over a century. So there's an effort to get back in and do Opium War 2.0, but not from China and not from Canada. It's this supernatural thing they're trying to do it to everybody. Cecil Rhodes, in his first will, or seventh will, writes that his new trust exists for the establishment and promotion and development of a secret society, the true aim and object whereof shall be the extension of British rule throughout the world. The colonization by British subjects of all lands where the means of livelihood are attainable by energy, labor, and enterprise, and especially the occupation by British settlers of the entire continent of Africa, the Holy Land, the Valley of the Euphrates, and the islands of Cyprus and Canada, the whole of South America, the islands of the Pacific, not heretofore possessed by Great Britain, the whole of the Malay Archipelago, a board of China, of China and Japan, and the ultimate recovery of the United States of America as an integral part of the British Empire. Is the manifesto that sort of served to govern the entire spirit of this thing over the next 120 years. And that's a famous picture of Cecil Rhodes standing across Africa that went viral in the day before internet. It went so viral that the Americans, under the new Teddy Roosevelt regime, were inspired to create it as a propaganda to announce the Teddy Roosevelt corollary that Roosevelt was able to bring in, who also introduced something called the Rhodesian. Well, he was an admirer of Cecil Rhodes. He was also a eugenicist. And he was somebody who looked upon King Edward VII, the guy who did the most to organize World War I. That Edward VII was seen as a teacher and a guide by Teddy Roosevelt. And you said that there were, in your research, there was some actual correspondences between Teddy and the king, right?
Yeah, it's a book.
Right. Okay. There were actual correspondences going on where the idea of an Anglo-American relationship, one tongue, one peoples, as the sign says, the English-speaking peoples would be one religiously organized unity of a movement that has the white man's burden together to subdue and to share the pain of the burden of dealing with the savages of the world and bring in what is sometimes known as, or what these Templar-esque type of beings thought of as being their very sick new kingdom of Jerusalem, this new idea of a new Templar-run kind of kingdom that was animating the Crusades for centuries and centuries. So that's sort of a thing announcing over the dead body of McKinley, who had to be killed for this to happen, that there'd be a new Anglo-American special relationship, that America would take on the role model of Cecil Rhodes as the inspiration for America's foreign policy now. So instead of looking towards Latin American countries as cooperative partners to share in mutual development, which is what McKinley was doing when he was trying to build rail lines, promote national banks, promote protectionism in all countries of Latin America. That's what he was fighting for when he got shot and killed. This was a different idea, saying, no, instead we're going to take dominant control over this entire region following the Cecil Rhodes program. And I'm not saying this is exactly what's been revived today, however, just to be aware of bad ideas when they happen, Pete Hegseth, not that long ago, Cynthia discovered this and brought this into one of her recent articles, and it blew my mind that Pete Hegseth actually promoted that image. To what degree these guys are fully aware of what they're awakening, I don't know, but bad ideas can get people killed if you're not aware of these dynamics. So that's something floating around that is tainting this concept of U.S. foreign policy in the Americas.
Next time.
Next time. Yeah, it was nice to test things out. So a little timeline again here. So in 1902, you have another thing set up at the same time as the Rhodes Trust is created, and at the same time that Teddy Roosevelt takes power over McKinley's dead body again, right? McKinley dies in 1902, Teddy Roosevelt takes power. You have the Pilgrim Society is founded. And there's one branch in London and a sister branch in the United States. The Rockefellers, the Vanderbilts, the DuPonts, the Morgans, all of the ruling families of America are all bankrolling it. The patron is the King of England. Today it still exists. For 10 years it was chaired by Sir Henry Kissinger. I said Sir because he was made a Knight of the Order of St. George and St. Michael by Her Majesty Queen Elizabeth II in 1993. A year later, George Bush Sr. was also made member of the Order of St. George and St. Michael, another British chivalric order. Today it's King Charles who is the current patron of this thing. That's the way it works. And the idea was to always integrate the United States back into the British Empire as outlined by Rhodes in 1877. So you have this thing set up. The Anglo-American Institute the Anglo-American International Institute was formed in 1919 with two branches, one in London, one in New York. Basically, they were pilgrim branches. Oh, by the way, I'll say this later. The London branch took on a name, basically, I'll skip that one. In 1926, the British Institute for International Affairs received a royal charter and it became the Royal Institute for International Affairs, sometimes known as Chatham House. And the New York branch was named the Council on Foreign Relations in 1921. Americans were still very suspicious about the British at those times, so they couldn't use something that had too similar of a sounding name as the British version. And that's the thing that 2009 that Secretary of State Hillary Clinton then admitted was the mothership when she was giving a speech at the new office of the CFR in Washington, saying the mothership has come to Washington, and that is, I think, a very indicative sentence, because her husband was also a Rhodes Scholar, right? And in fact, it wasn't just him; it was Stroke Talbot. It was 20 members that came in with the Clinton administration who were all Rhodes Scholars, who at the same time as they did that, created, one of the first things Bill Clinton did is he created the Teddy Roosevelt room in the White House as an homage to Teddy Roosevelt, and I think the spirit of what Teddy Roosevelt was doing. Yes, sir.
I also came across a quote, Hillary Clinton. She was justifying why the United States was spending $1 billion on doing embassy in the UK.
Yeah.
And she was saying, well, all the decisions that we take in such close consultations with London, that we need this. I was never able to find that quote then.
It's reminiscent to the, because everybody heard what Alex just said?
No, go ahead.
He noted that Hillary had said not that long ago, when she was asked, why are you spending so much money on this massive embassy in London? Why are you, was it $1 billion?
Yeah.
Like $1 billion, why are you, what justifies that? And she said, well, because we make so many of our decisions in direct consultation with London, it's basically the right thing to do, I guess. You know? Got it, yeah.
Expedient.
Yes, and it would do Kissinger proud, right? Because Kissinger also famously said in 1981 that during his time running the State Department, he spent more time briefing the British Foreign Office than his own U.S. State Department. And he said that at Chatham House in London, basically admitting openly that he was working for the British while he was overseeing the Vietnam War, the Trilateral Commission takeover of America, the ouster of Nixon. That's pretty much what this guy was pretty busy beat. A controlled energy crisis that he also organized artificially to psychologically traumatize Americans and Canadians about the idea that we live in a world of scarcity. And meanwhile, as the facts bore out years later, he actually kept these oil tankers full of oil off the coast of America to not actually arrive, and in order for gas stations to run dry and psychologically shock their eyes. That's a new word, y'all can use it if you want. American people, so that we would be more susceptible and adaptable to the idea of limits to growth. Don't think about making things better. Don't think about more. Don't think about abundance. Think about adaptation. Yes, sir.
People also know that in J.P. Morgan's house in London is 10 times larger than his house in New York and Rhode Island. That's how important it is.
Yeah, I've heard it said as well that like a lot of the upper nobility, the wannabe nobles in America, they even will mimic a pseudo-British accent, right, as part of their just psychological profiling. It's a strange thing. Rhodes Scholars penetrate Canada. So here's just some of the notable key figures who you probably haven't heard about in your history books, as Carol quickly said, but they're really important to the story. And if anybody wants to buy the books, or there's digital copies too of the Untold History of Canada, it goes into detail of each one of these individuals and what they did. But you got here Vincent Massey, the head of the Roundtable movement for like 40 years in Canada. He was the first Canadian born Governor General. You got here Norman Robertson, Jack Pickersgill, Arnold Heaney, Lester D. Pearson was a Macy scholar at Oxford. S. Scott Reed, the actual ideological founder of NATO. F.R. Scott, handler of Pierre Trudeau. Hugh Morong, another key figure who's an architect of modern globalization. All of these guys and many more, these are all Rhodes Scholars who played a key role in shaping Canada after World War II.
I like how they tried to change the names on those Pearson Airport stuff like that.
That's
statues.
Yeah, Pearson and the Trudeau Air Force, they just,
Keep that. Frank Zappa.
Frank Zappa lived a little bit longer. Yeah. Good haircut. Oh yeah, she did get hair. So yeah, when I mentioned that the Roundtable was set up in Canada, that was 1928, and it was called the Canadian Institute for International Affairs. Those are the three founders of it. Rhodes Scholar S. Scott Reed in the middle. Sir Robert Borden, who was the Prime Minister who was brought in to replace Wilfrid Laurier, and the guy who brought us into World War I unnecessarily. Wilfrid Laurier was not going to allow us to do that. He was rewarded by being president. He was the first secretary. And this guy, Newman, another Rhodes Scholar, were the founders of that. At the same time, I didn't mention that there was a second think tank that always worked together with the Roundtable movement of Cecil Rhodes. That was called the Fabian Society. And while the Roundtable movement worked out of the London School of Economics, the Roundtable movement worked out of Oxford, the Fabian Society worked out of the London School of Economics. And it came into Canada at a certain point in 1931 in the form of a think tank called the League for Social Reconstruction. The League for Social Reconstruction was designed to basically to deal with the economic depression by getting rid of the elected class, getting rid of conventional forms of capitalism, and saying that we need now a new scientifically managed post-nation-state order of technocrats. The founders of this Fabian Society of Canada, and you can read their manifesto, there were six Rhodes Scholars, of which I only recall the names here of S. Scott Reed, F.R. Scott, David Lewis. David Lewis is that guy, whose grandson is Avi Lewis, who's the head of the NDP party today. So they do keep it. Yeah. And Frank Underhill was Oxford, as well as a Fabian and a eugenicist too, promoting the idea that eugenics has got to be the queen of all sciences coming into the future. So there was an overlap there. So the fact that you have a left-wing, seemingly socialist society like Fabians being created by six nominally right-wing conservative, members of a Roundtable movement, which is like the stiff upper lip British conservative values was what they were supposed to fill. They were actually working together the whole time. And I'll just say one thing too, is that the political party that they created in 1932, because they had a political party immediately created called the Cooperative Commonwealth Federation. Truly. And that became the political aspect of, or the basis of the NDP. They got a name change in 1960, right? Yeah. So one of the figures at the foundation of the Cooperative Commonwealth, the Canadian Fabian Society political party in Saskatchewan, is this guy right here. So in 1933 to 1936, the head of the Canadian Fabian Society of Saskatchewan is Joshua Haldeman, not Elon, but his grandfather. And when that ran its ground and he couldn't quite get near political power, he ended up becoming the head of a new party called the Technocracy Incorporated movement, which he ran from 1936 to 1940 until he got arrested for being on the wrong side of World War II. Because essentially what they were calling for was getting rid of national governments and instituting an unelected bureaucracy of technocrats and scientific managers to manage basically the capital. But in a different word, they didn't like that word, but yeah.
Did you say Musk's grandfather?
That's Musk's grandfather, yeah. After that didn't work, he got out of, well, he didn't go to jail, he just got arrested. But after that didn't work, and they had to shut down Technocracy in Canada, he headed up the Social Credit Party of Saskatchewan for another 7 years. And when he couldn't get power through that venue, he ended up going to what he said was the freest place in the world, South Africa, the day they started apartheid. He went. And he starts basically serving as a propagandist. He has a printing press. He's promoting apartheid as the solution to all of the world's problems. And if anybody looks into apartheid and how it was organized, pretty much if you want to have national ID cards, districts that you're allowed to move in or out of based upon the status of your genetic profile, that's where you would look at as a role model for that. Cecil Rhodes in South Africa. Huh?
Like it isn't.
Yeah. No, it's not so too close to home. And this is a little map that a lot of people have seen this at this point. But that is published in their Technocracy study guide. That was sort of the manifesto of what they wanted. So, as an ideal organization for North America was a new singular unijurisdictional system of command and control with a technique, with local small jurisdictions, small districts that would not be able to influence the top-down managerial policies of the Technocracy. It was called the technique. That guy there in gray is Howard Scott. He was the founder. He actually was trained in New School, an off-branch of Columbia University, under a network set up by John Dewey in 1919 to 1921, which is the Fabian Society in America. So I mentioned the CFR is the Rhodes Scholarship in America. This network in New School in Columbia was where you had the Fabians of America also set up. And that's what he was...
I'm sure Trump is putting together.
You know what? It smells similar, you know. To what degree, again, he's fully aware of this stuff, I don't know. I'm just saying, like, you've got to be aware of these historical patterns to not fall into traps. That's one of their Technocrats magazine promoting the idea of the inevitable unemployment of automation and also the destructive nature of self-thinking machines that would inevitably, you know, destroy humanity by 1940. 30 million out of work in 1933, or $20,000 a year income for every family. Which one do you want? With a robot, you know, killing civilians, right? Running amok like an AI demon, striking lightning bolts onto people. And part of the technocracy idea was universal basic income, that everybody would be allotted a certain amount of credits based upon how much they consume. That could be measured in some scalar metric, how many calories it took to make the goods, move the goods, take in the goods, that each individual.
CO2 footprint.
Yeah. There's other ways they can spin it, but yeah.
When did this come out? Because this was before or after the Wizard of Oz? This is a hat that's uncanny. Similar.
It could be. I think it's after the Wizard of Oz. I think the Wizard of Oz is like, no, yeah, way after that. That's like 1904 something, Wizard of Oz, right, or 1911. But this is like 1920s.
Okay.
That's a picture I mentioned here of Avi Lewis, with his wife, the author of Shock Doctrine, Naomi Klein. Naomi Klein, the head of the guy who wants to be prime minister. I don't know if that's going to happen. Scott Reed, I mentioned here. Okay, so the guy who sets up the Canadian Roundtable, he's one of the 6 co-founders of the Canadian Fabian Society. Scott Reed also sets up NATO. That's a picture of him and Lester B. Pearson, 1947, 2 years before NATO was actually created. He's founding what's known as the Caucasian conferences. And he says it would be part of this draft program of this new supranational military alliance to replace and get out of the UN Security Council, which gives too much authority and influence to Russia and China that they shouldn't have. So we needed something new that we could just act upon unilaterally as a military power, kind of like the League of Nations that failed. We need to get that going again. NATO was the thing that was going to do it. And he says it would be easier and more self-respecting for Canada to give up to an international body on which it was represented the decisions on which it should go to war, than to transfer the right to make that decision from the government of Ottawa to the government of Washington. It would thus appear probable and that effective military cooperation between Canada and the United States is possible only within the framework of an effective world order of which both Canada and the United States are loyal members. So the idea was to always destroy the sovereignty of nations to have a right to control their own destiny and instead create something supernatural that they would control against the will of the people. So while this is all happening, Canada's still got to fight. You know, people are still inspired by Lincoln, by McKinley, by FDR's efforts to battle against this deep state complex inside of the United States that took over his dead body. One of the key figures that I think is important within this context is this guy here, W.A.C. Bennett. And that's him inaugurating the Peace River Dam in the north of BC. These are just some of the major, what you see here is an image of the North American Water and Power Alliance, which many people around Bennett were pushing for. Later on, Bobby Kennedy was also advocating this thing be developed. And the first phase of it was actually built up through his work on the Columbia River Treaty Basin in the south of BC, as well as in the northern Peace River that created the entire electrical renaissance, a hydroelectric renaissance that also generated BC Hydro, that he was able to kind of like nationalize through a battle with his private power core of BC at the time that didn't want to allow for any kind of real qualitative development. So he was going off the rails and using the province of BC as a Republican country with all the powers to direct and control the development of the natural resources of BC. And he did it well with the support also at the time of John F. Kennedy, who gave him a lot of clout and support. And the revenue that he was able to build up, all of the revenue he was able to build up by creating these industrial processes of lumber, of mining, of all sorts of things he did. Such a revenue was created that he was then able to invest in Quebec and gave Quebec the loans that they couldn't get from the Bank of Canada, so that Quebec, when they were being strangled and not being allowed to develop their hydroelectric potential, received the loan from Bennett that gave them the ability to invest and build up the Hudson River and the James Lake, James Bay hydroelectric area that turned Quebec into a hydroelectric. That 95% of Quebec's power comes from hydro for that reason. Not because of Ottawa, but because you had provinces working together against a common enemy that wanted to destroy both their ability to develop. Yeah.
In the previous slide, you said Bennett with Creation BC Hydro was quite hardcore. Is it the same power core in Toronto run by
Summarize?
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, it's spun off, right? So you had Montreal Light Traction. That was what controlled as a private enterprise in all the major vital infrastructure of Quebec. It was tied to another thing that was created in 1899 called Brazilian Light Traction, which was later on given over to the Bronco dynasty to manage, and that controlled most of the infrastructure of Brazil. It later on became Brascan, that became Brookfield. So Montreal Light Traction, at a certain point when there was a fight to nationalize them, which happened in Quebec, and that created. Oh no, that we failed. That's right. The BC it worked on, and that became BC Hydro. Bennett also was able to create the Bank of BC that was supposed to be kind of like a greenback issuing national bank, which also was sabotaged. That's actually how HSBC got into Canada, was because Bennett's Bank of BC, which is supposed to be a productive credit issuing bank for the development of, like for example, what you have here, is Bennett's program for rail. These are all the rail lines that Bennett built up all the way up to East Lake, which still exist, and they call it the rail to nowhere. They spent years trying to sell for like $1. Bennett's plan was for that to happen. So the idea was for that to be the first phase of a plan to connect rail all the way up into Alaska. That was sabotaged when he was ousted in 1972. And when you look at some of the key figures around him within his own provincial administration, as well as within Ottawa around Diefenbaker, that Diefenbaker didn't understand included a lot of key road scholars themselves. I'm gonna list one or two of them soon. Bennett had a vision, though. He said, of all the interests I have in public life, none is a greater challenge. No money in this province could pay me for the satisfaction I would feel if this railway were changed from a joke and put on a sound financial basis. Speaking about the BC to Alaska railway that he was trying to build. And that could be built again, frankly. He says here in describing the two-river program of the Columbia River program on the Canadian side and the Peace River system that was built up with major dams, reservoirs, and hydropower. He says, this is the most momentous announcement that I have ever made. The studies being conducted in the north indicate the feasibility of establishing the Rocky Mountain Trench, in the Rocky Mountain Trench, the greatest hydroelectric project in the world, and would be entirely in the control of the government of British Columbia. This day is the most important that BC has experienced in the whole history. Surely now both Ottawa and the US will realize that we mean business. That just shows you what like somebody with a real attitude and a care to develop their people can do even on a provincial level. It's solid. And like I said, he wasn't alone. His work helped make this possible. And so whether it was Jean Lesage or our Premier Daniel Johnson with the National Union Party speaking next to Charles de Gaulle, who was brought in from France to speak to the Québécois as part of the grand design that France had after de Gaulle kicked out NATO from France. He fought against the French fascists that were part of the Organisation de l'Armée Secrète that was caught trying to kill him like 18 times. Along with Permidex, a Montreal-based assassination bureau set up by the same guy who oversaw the murder of JFK. But that thing was kicked out of France. He kicked out Permidex, he kicked out NATO, he shut down the Imperial faction that wanted to keep control of Algeria and other French colonies. He let them go free. And his idea was for Quebec, genuine Quebec nationalism to emerge with France, with other French-speaking people, together to say no more to empire, and they would go for a pro-development project together against the wishes of the empire. And you had Bobby Kennedy as well in the United States moving in those same circles. So it was a very interesting play that was being put into motion at that moment. And just to get across to, that gave rise to that fight. It wasn't like the oligarchy just gave Quebec or gave BC the hydropower that they have. These are all the dams that exist currently across Quebec. That was a fight every single step of the way against saboteurs. Who were some of the saboteurs? Oxford scholar, Rhodes Scholar, Oxford, technocrats. David Fulton, the Justice Minister of under Diefenbaker, who spent a lot of work sabotaging everything Diefenbaker was trying to do to build up his northern vision. Everything that he failed to do was largely caused by the organization of the deep state under this Rhodes Scholar here, who had a grouping known as Fulton's Boys. Michael Pitfield, the guy who found Cesis, his Trudeau Shadows, was one of A.B. Fulton's boys. That guy, Michael Lalonde, or Marc Lalonde, another Rhodes Scholar, who also goes on with Pitfield to co-create the Club of Rome in Canada in 1970 with Morty Strong. These guys that are part of the Oxford network that Diefenbaker doesn't understand for 1 second. He does understand, but he doesn't know how to deal with another Rhodes Scholar, James Coyne. James Coyne is the governor of the Bank of Canada. He is the only case we have in Canada of a governor of the Bank of Canada getting fired by the Prime Minister. In no other circumstance, this has never happened except this one time in 1958.
And now they become Prime Minister.
Now they become Prime Minister. Sure. So what happens, right? Diefenbaker unleashes, what's that? Diefenbaker announces his northern vision for Arctic science cities powered by nuclear energy that would be tied with rail together as part of a science and mining renaissance program to open up the north the way, as he says, McDonald opened up the west. And it was a beautiful vision. He had a program to make it work. The problem was you had a massive recession going on in 1957, 58. There was a big credit crunch. And Diefenbaker began to fight with the governor of the Bank of Canada because Diefenbaker knew, hey, this Bank of Canada, we should be able to use it the way Lincoln was able to use greenbacks to emit credit during the Civil War to build up big projects that will then be self-liquidating because once they're built, it might take 8 or 10 years, but once they're built, they will extinguish the debt that you incurred getting there. That's like healthy debt versus just speculative, sick debt or usurious debt. So he had this big fight. He had a whole program to transform the maturing victory bonds of World War II that were also coming to maturity at 1958 that people were cashing in on. And he's like, no, let's not do that while we're in a recession. Let's transform these things into development bonds for the Arctic. And a lot of Canadians were really gung-ho to do this. The problem was he needed the complicity of the Bank of Canada. The Bank of Canada was run by this Rhodes Scholar guy. And he said, no, we're going to reduce the credit. We're going to retract credit. We're going to go for austerity instead. And a battle ensued. The guy was not going to change his position. He got fired by Diefenbaker. The problem was Diefenbaker didn't realize what a scandal would be set up, and pretty much James Coyne was able to organize a massive campaign along with Davy Fulton and a few other Rhodes Scholars to pretty much weaponize the media and portray Diefenbaker like a traitor to his country, and it resulted in Diefenbaker's ultimate political career ending on the federal level. He still remained as a member of parliament, but that was it. But it was kind of like a Russiagate kind of formula used against Diefenbaker in those days in '63, the same year that JFK is killed by the Montreal-based permanent export. So in Montreal, what do you have? In Quebec, you got here this grouping of technocrats that Pierre Trudeau has brought into. He's still an NDP member at this time. He's not a Liberal yet. And it's called the Institute for Research into Public Law. And you have several Rhodes Scholars. John Beats is a Rhodes Scholar called Goldenberg Rhodes Scholar, Mike Lalonde. The founder of this guy here is the founder of Paul Guérin Najoie, who founds the Ministry of Education that oversees a complete overhaul of what is curriculum, what do you allow into schools for the youth, is overseen by these guys who then bring in Darwinism as a new fact instead of a theory. They bring in they basically replace the study of the classics, dead old white, European males that aren't relevant anymore, should be replaced with more relevant modern thinkers that are like more nihilistic, like Sartre. Things that are going to break the soul of young people as effectively as possible. That's what these guys were overseeing infused into our school system. Vincent Massey, as I mentioned, the head of the Roundtable movement, is working with this guy to create what's known as the Massey-Lebec Commission. Georges-Henri Levesque is the guy who runs the Université de Laval and runs this department that sets up a program to de-Christianize Quebec. That's a high priority. Now, this commission is designed to de-Americanize Canada, because at the time, too many Canadians were still inspired by the example of what the US had done during World War II, how effectively the Americans were able to increase their living standards, embrace industry, do all of these incredible things like what we saw under the New Deal was something that was inspiring a lot of Canadians. We're like, we want this kind of system too. And that had to come undone. So that commission started taking control and centralizing control of who funds and controls our culture. The Canadian Council of Arts was created by these guys to create a central body that would then have control financially over what types of art gets money, what types of research in the social sciences get money, and what doesn't. What types of music are going to be funded, what is not. So if you're going to be an artist, you still got to pay your bills. And if you're going to pay your bills, that means you have to meet now new standards aesthetically that will please those experts ideologically who are heading these councils, who will then give you a grant so that you could, like, not die. Right? And increasingly, and then you see how this could work, the nudging, right? Because the only things that are being granted money are nihilistic art that's postmodern, that reflects ugliness instead of beauty. And increasingly, what happens when all the artists start producing ugly art? Well, you have people who are taught to admire ugly abstract art becoming, does that make them better people? Or worse people, less capable of actually figuring out the universe and solving problems? And I would say that the part of the design, I think, of this whole thing was to destroy the aesthetical ability to discern beauty from ugliness. And once you do that, your ability of judging an ugly idea from a beautiful idea is also reduced. Your ability to decide what's right and wrong is going to be handicapped heavily the more people get into that modality. And this is where Macy had been working very closely with the organization that had formerly been funding all of the Canadian postmodernist work, which was the Rockefeller Foundation. So they basically took over funding from the Rockefeller Foundation that had formerly, before 1950, been carrying the burden of financing Canadian arts, as well as history research. This thing, part of what Macy put forth is he said we need to, because he was directly trained by Milner. So he was known as one of Milner's boys when he was sent to Ottawa and when he was a young man. Keep in mind, what did Milner say? Of the three possibilities for the future, either closer imperial union, independence, or union with the Americans, right? The one that was a danger was closer cooperation with the Americans. A type of Canadian synthetic nationalism would be advisable, as Milner said in 1909. It makes especially the younger of the Canadians, bumptiously vigorous and prideful and boastful of the greatness of their country and so forth. He isn't there, it's a social engineer. So the plan was, how do you create a controllable synthetic nationalism? And this is where the founders of it come in. James Coyne, there's three known recognized founders of the New Nationalism policy of Canada. New Nationalism, which emerged with the downfall of Diefenbaker, right, 1963, included Walter Lockhart Gordon, George Grant, the grandfather of Michael Ignatius, former head of the Liberal Party. He's also the grandson of George Perkins, the founder, the head of the Rhodes Trust movement, and teacher of Cecil Rhodes, was his grandfather. So that Rhodes scholar there, and that guy who's the head of the Roundtable movement in Canada, he's the head of the Canadian Institute for International Affairs, the chief executive officer, and the head of Clarkson Gordon that helped oversee all of the banking regulations that facilitated Canada's role in shaping the Cayman Islands, offshore drug money laundering, tax havens. That's Canada for you. Thank you, great powers. That's what this guy was overseeing as the top accountant of Canada and the president of the Privy Council office in the 1960s. So these guys are organizing how to create a new nationalism that has the illusion of being patriotic, but none of the reality of what goes with. So that part of the program involved creating a new flag. 1963, the announcement of a new maple leaf flag was made public.
Those going backpacks. Those going backpacks.
Oh yeah. Everybody likes maple syrup, right? So And that's one of the big jokes, right? Is that most countries have symbols, they have colors on their map designs that indicate something of a freedom fight, something of moral aspirations that are symbolic within the flags. And then the Canadian flag, you don't have that. If you ask around what is the symbolic value of that leaf, of those colors of red, it's purely aesthetic, and people like maple syrup is I think really what it comes down to.
Very Laurentian. Very Laurentian.
Very Laurentian, very East Coast. Yeah.
I have a question about rose colors
Yeah.
and the rose colors.
Sure.
So, like, what is it about astrology that creates this sort of a cabal of secret?
Let's come back to that as soon as we wrap up. We'll open up Q&A because that's a conversation piece right there. All right. So George Grant, in his famous Lament for a Nation, 1963, writes, it's kind of like a real manifesto for this new nationalism, that the aspirations of progress have made Canada redundant. The universal and homogeneous state is the pinnacle of political striving. Universal implies a worldwide state, which would eliminate the curse of war among nations. Homogeneous means that all men would be equal, and war among classes would be eliminated. The masses and the philosophers have both agreed that the universal and egalitarian society is the goal of historical striving. It gives content to the rhetoric of both communists and capitalists. This state will be achieved by means of modern science, a science that leads to the conquest of nature. Now, just on top of just talking about this garbage of getting rid of nations for this world state, if you read further on, when he talks about like what is his idea of what science is and what's its purpose, he's talking about neuroscience, brain science, drugs. He's not talking about anything that actually makes life better for people. So that's like the very narrow definition of this guy's idea of conquesting nature, is more conquesting the brain and controlling people. Walter Gordon is the head also of something called the Walter Gordon Commission that produced a 2-year-long study on how to de-Americanize Canada. There was too many American companies that had influence in Canada that were breaking us out of our monarchical subjecthood. And he writes in his report that was published in '57 that many Canadians are worried about such a large degree of economic decision-making being in the hands of non-residents of America because it might lead to economic domination by the United States and eventually to the loss of our political independence. That could be said to be a legitimate grievance. We all know that a lot of American companies that do very bad things have had way too much influence over the Canadian economy at different times. No doubt. That's him right there to teaching, organizing students to mobilize against America. He founds the Waffle Movement that produced like Mel Watkins and the Canadian nationalist movement that were his followers. Now the problem is, does he really care, or is this a disgenuine argument? He's acting like he cares about Canada, but he's the head of the Canadian Institute for International Affairs and overseeing global narcotics trafficking and offshore money laundering havens on behalf of RBC and these other major banks. Does he actually care about Canadian independence, or is there a higher geopolitical agenda that he's representing in these otherwise fiery words that awaken a certain patriotism? And if you ask a lot of Canadians, right, like, what is it that makes you a patriotic Canadian? There's usually this response that I tend to get. Maybe it's more on the East Coast than on the West Coast, but I'll tell you, you'll often get, I'm not American. We're not Americans. Like, that's over. Yeah, Alberta's not, that doesn't have that issue so much. But that is a big thing in the psyche, especially amongst people who lived through the 1960s, 70s, Vietnam War. They saw America go empire. They saw these great men get killed like Martin Luther King. They saw America go crazy. And so they got repulsed by what that was. And so I can understand and sympathize why especially young people following this type of propaganda would go to that extreme. But it's a trap. And S. Scott Reed is just another one as well. It was virulently anti-American, but he said we should submit and work with an American-run monopoly over nuclear weapons. If there's a world state controlling all of the nations, then we should allow that. So it's like, yeah, you're not really using words for the right reasons here. Imperial Trudeau was set up, like I said, he switched parties when it was clear that the NDP were not going to get into political power. And what he did by going to the Liberals, as he was first brought in under Pearson to be the Minister of Justice, and then quickly he had talent. He was a Jesuit-trained, highly disciplined technocrat, probably a bit smarter than Carney, but had like that same quality of competence that is very rare for one of these assholes. So they rewarded him. He could speak both languages, he jumped in and out of both worlds, and he was good in the debate, big on his feet, and he was the guy brought in to Canada, to the federal office. Pearson couldn't really speak French. It was sloppy. Now the thing about Pierre Trudeau is that that's him walking with his fellow technocrats into Ottawa, where he's about to take the helm in 1968, July 6, 1968. They're called the New Reformers. It's really just a technocratic quiet revolution that completely overhauls the entire civil service of Canada. He basically beefs up the Privy Council office, the Prime Minister's office, as nerve centers of control to manage every aspect of human life in society. He himself is a Fabian. So I mentioned earlier on, you had F.R. Scott was one of the founders of the Fabian Society and an Oxford Rhodes Scholar. He was one of the early handlers of Trudeau, who had been sent by the Jesuits. He was, a young man with a lot of wealth, an heir of a lot of money, sent to go and study under William Yandell Elliott, the Oxford Rhodes Scholar in Harvard, who had his little Harvard-Oxford Young Men program, where he trained people like Sir Henry Kissinger, Zbigniew Brzezinski, Samuel P. Huntington, and Trudeau in his very productive and far too long-lived life. This William Yandell Elliott was quite something, but he saw the talent in Trudeau and sent him off to Harold Lasky at the London School of Economics in 1947. And under Lasky, he was the head of the Fabian Society, the head of the Labour Party, that's the Fabian political party in England. I mentioned the NDP was the Canadian branch, right? That's the English branch. He was given a 500-day tour of the empire, Pierre Trudeau's 500-day voyage, where he got to see how the empire works in Lebanon and get thrown in prison in Egypt, and basically a spy learning the ropes of management. Then he was sent back to Ottawa to be set up in the Privy Council office. And that's where he was working very closely with the crowd I mentioned, Father Henri Levesque, who had this little grouping at the Université de Laval. The idea was to de-Christianize Quebec. So that was part of his assignment with Cité Libre, this magazine that was promoting this idea of a revolution against Christianity. That the reason why we have injustice, the problems why Quebecois are feeling like they have despair for the future is because their Christianity is a problem. And so they organized this mass revolt of young baby boomers to become political, weaponized tools to overthrow and carry out this technocratic regime change that does happen in 1963. There's a small moment when Quebec gains power, or the nationalists gain power again, when de Gaulle comes to Quebec, but that's very short-lived. So the thing that crushes that resistance in Quebec, that Christian resistance that was causing such grief to the oligarchs, was martial law, right? You had tanks on the streets of Montreal in October of 1970. Are people familiar with martial law in Quebec? Yeah, number 2, right after World War I.
Can you explain it a little bit? Can you explain it a little bit?
Yeah, Quebec Marxist-Leninist terrorist cells were setting up bombs throughout the 1960s, trying to act like they were the representatives of nationalism, of self, and against empire. That's the way these young idiots were set up and recruited to fight empire, was set up public mailbox bombs for years. It was part of Gladiator, yeah. It's the same model that was done for the Red Brigades in Italy and in Germany, same thing, right? And in the case in Quebec, it was a lot of the French fascists that were brought in, not the German fascists, to manage the creation of these synthetic domestic terror cells that then justified, once there were 2 politicians who were kidnapped. One was a British consulate, Consular General of Britain from Montreal was kidnapped. And then a few days later, the Deputy Premier of Quebec, Pierre Laporte, was also kidnapped. Laporte ends up getting killed. They strangle him with a cross necklace and leave him in the trunk of a car. The same MO that was done to Aldo Moro in Italy a few years later. While he's kidnapped, that's used as an excuse by Pierre Trudeau to declare martial law. Right? What's discovered later on, though, is that the very RCMP Special Operations Unit that Pierre Elliott Trudeau was running with several of his Rhodes Scholar operatives that I write about in Volume 4 of the Untold History of Canada were actually running the FLQ terrorist cells. And that is why the RCMP, they were exposed in all of the public press, their investigative reports. We had the McDonald Commission on the federal level, the Keeble Commission on the provincial level that proved how the RCMP had been managing these domestic terrorist cells in order to create a climate of fear in the population and then justify a increased security state. And that exposure resulted in the creation of CSIS. That's why CSIS was created, was because the RCMP was discovered to be behind all of these things, right? And that was done at the same year.
Wasn't it exactly the same people that led to?
And it was the same exact same person. It was Michael Pitfield, the Trudeau Shadow, who was the guy overseeing this operation, or a big player within the October crisis. Michael Pitfield, who was the clerk of the Privy Council, who was the guy who found CSIS, the same year that they're setting up the National Endowment for Democracy, that the CIA is setting up in 1983 in America for similar reasons. Right now, Trudeau, when he's doing this overhaul of government, he makes a point, the new language of control that we're going to bring in to manage this new bureaucratized, highly compartmentalized system that he oversees is called Cybernetics, the science of control. And he says, he gives a speech in 1969 in Hamilton, Ontario, saying, we are aware of the many techniques of cybernetics by transforming the control function and the manipulation of information will transform our whole society. With this knowledge, we are wide awake, alert, capable of action. No longer are we blind, inert powers of fate. What the hell is talking about? So what this is, basically cybernetics is something that was innovated during World War II as a way of trying to imagine systems and then influencing the systems that you're imagining. So everything is a system. Your body is a system, the cell is a system, humanity is a system, the soul, the planets around the sun is a system, the galaxy is a system. Everything is a one with parts moving within it for a purpose. Now, how do you think about the nature of those systems such that you can then influence them in the most organic way possible? As if we have understanding of a thing, if you understand the cell, you can understand the causes of health and thus disease, you can intervene to make the sick healthy. If you don't understand what you're acting upon or you have wrong assumptions about what these systems are, you can do a lot of damage. One of the fundamental principles of cybernetics is that every system has to be managed as a whole that is the sum of its parts. Not more than the sum of its parts, which is in fact what we all are as human systems. Our identities are more than the sum total of the atoms that make us up. There's something additional that make us who we are and not something else. These guys don't acknowledge that. They think everything is kind of like a linear computing system, and as such, you can have one nerve center where an executive branch of vetted agents who have a certain privileged status will be able to see what the whole is doing in all the different compartments. Let's say you're dealing with the Ministry of Education or a Ministry of, let's say, NATO, which is organized under cybernetic principles. Every department, or the Manhattan Project is a great example, right? It's one thing, but every department, every laboratory and sub-laboratory doesn't know what the other laboratory is doing, right? Everybody's hyper-myopically specialized so that everybody is actually playing a role within a conspiracy that's going to be doing damage to themselves, their loved ones, their world, and they don't know it. Because they're so trained mentally to only see what they've been trained to see, and only a small vetted grouping can see the whole, of which he saw himself as one of the privileged helmsmen. Right? Now, what they did at that very same time as he was overhauling and vamping up the Privy Council office and these other things to manage deputy governors, deputy ministers that are not elected, that manage the elected ministers of the Canadian political system, he was also working with Maurice Strong to create the guy who set up the Canadian International Development Association, right? That same Maurice Strong that was overseeing giving money to countries if they brought in sustainable development energy, and giving money to Jamaica if they allowed for Walter Gordon to go in to revamp the bank acts so that they could be an easier money laundering hub or produce marijuana as a cash crop instead of having a real economy. That's what these guys were doing during that time. That's why so these guys, they're also setting up the Canadian Club of Rome in 1970, the first iteration of this thing. The money that is accrued, taxpayer Canadian money in 1970 at the this Montebello meeting of the Club of Rome that Caroline Trudeau is sponsoring, is the money that then immediately goes into MIT that produces the Limits to Growth report, which is right there. These are the two founders, by the way, of the Club of Rome. That's Alexander King, the former director of the Science Policy Director of the British Empire, also the head of the OECD from 1950 to 1954 before he becomes the head of the Club of Rome International. That's Aurelio Pache. He's the no, I mean, he really is.
Why did they call it the Club of Rome? What's the sport?
I got several theories, but I'm not prepared to talk about that. Yeah, we're talking about. So what is the club? What is this Limits to Growth report funded by Canadian taxpayers? It was produced in 1972. It basically said, okay, we thought Malthus was wrong. We thought that the idea of Malthusian predictions of overpopulation that Malthus was trying to popularize in 1799, those were wrong. We thought they were wrong because of technology and progress, but actually he was right. And we know he's right because now we have new computing powers. So we can plug in more data and churn out basically data regarding pollution, food production, available land resources, space, and population growth mathematically, and then chart out linear models, linear extrapolations into the future, and then predict scientifically where the population is going to exceed the needs of supporting the population according to how much pollution that population gives off, how much poop and fart each person makes, in terms to the warming of the earth. And resources are going to deplete as pollution goes up, and we'll eventually have an inevitable complete collapse of our population by necessity. And since it's the law of nature that it happens, and we predicted it through our computer models, we should help make this happen anyway, right? Because it's going to happen anyway, so we might as well do our best to manage that collapse. So that was a sick and toxic idea. But despite that, it was brought in immediately in 1973 into the World Economic Forum, the third annual meeting of the World Economic Forum, sponsored by Frits Bernhard of the Netherlands. He's the sole sponsor of the third forum, the World Economic Forum, where he brought in Aurelio Pache to set these computer models as the new standard around which the new managerial elite would be expected to be abide by almost religiously if they were going to be permitted to have positions of authority within the corporate or the private sector, whatever, or public sector. They had to pay homage to this new god, this new sort of Molochian god of depopulation that we have to now accept as the fate of mankind, that we have to be instruments of worshiping. And that demands human sacrifice. Ecosystems management became the name of the game. At that point, you had Environment Canada that Pierre Trudeau brought in, which immediately blocked WAC Bennett's program for all of that Western development that Bennett was pushing. Immediately, the first thing that happens under Trudeau's prime ministership is he creates protected lands, nature protection zones that are off limits from human development, and they're all over the West Coast. And that immediately puts the brakes on all of the momentum that we had going on.
Christian Freeland set up 6 of those in Alberta.
Well, there you go. And a road scholar, right?
Yep.
So the founders of the Canadian Club of Rome include, just a list here, I thought I'd just throw it out there for people who, like trivia, but you had Maurice Strong, right? Former head of CETA. Maurice Lamontagne, I'm going to say something very fascinating about when I said I'm going to end with a crazy, interesting quote that you're going to blow your mind. It's going to be from that guy. This guy, Maurice Lamontagne, was one of the Davy Fulton boys, also a Rhodes Scholar. No, he's just Oxford trained, but still Davy Fulton boy. Who ends up becoming the chair of the Senate Science and Technology Commission that overhauls all of how Canada funds research development and the application of those things in the form of technology. And that was from 1969 to 1973. He's overseeing this report. The report is published, and there's some crazy things in it. Another guy here, and just put that in the back of your mind, Roland Michener is a Governor General of Canada and Rhodes Scholar. Michael Pitfield, I already mentioned, is the founder of the Club of Rome, along with co-founder of CSIS later on. Alistair Gillespie, Rhodes Scholar, Sarah Nixon, Privy Council Office Chief, Mark Malone, Rhodes Scholar, True Advisor. So that's the big names here. There's several more Rhodes Scholars that I didn't add to the list because it's so big. Maurice Lamontagne, in his Science and Technology's Senate report, states, it's so useful, during the early part of the 19th century, Great Britain and, to a lesser extent, France, were fast developing industrial technology and finding ways of fruitfully exploiting science. Later on, the United States moved from technological backwardness to such a level that it could begin exporting to the advanced European countries manufacturing techniques and machine tools so different that the whole approach became known as the American system. An English productivity team that visited the United States in 1853 to study this system concluded that men serve God in America in all seriousness and sincerity through striving for economic efficiency. They don't respect that at all, right?
Yeah, you can't have that.
No, that's verboten. So it clearly identifies this American system as something other than anything else. Clearly has no respect on it. But then he's describing how the problem is, how do we deal, because he's the founder of the Club of Rome, the co-founder, right? So he's got a different set of things that he thinks are problems than a normal human being. And he's describing here, right, 1973, big year, oil crisis, oil shocks are being arranged by Sir Henry Kissinger. Already mentioned that, right? So you got already the trauma psychologically being put into the zeitgeist of scarcity that we have to adapt to. He says, it is becoming apparent, however, that nature is not as passive as we thought, that it has its own laws and can revenge itself once its own equilibrium has been disrupted. Nature imposes definite constraints on technology itself, and if man persists in ignoring them, the net effect of his actions in the long run can be to reduce rather than to increase nature's potential as provider of resources and habitable space. But then an obvious question arises. How can we stop man's cravings? What the hell?
That's not the question that comes into my head.
Because he clearly identifies that when man becomes creative, we make scientific industrial progress. We solve problems, we build a dam, the dam changes nature, but now all of a sudden the salmon are not going to have the type of behavioral patterns they used to have when they want to replenish their species, so you're going to change things. And these guys are all making the point. The case that he's making is that every time we try to change nature, we make things worse. But changing nature is the cause of our creativity. So how do you get to the source of the problem, right? How do you get rid of the cause of those changes, or the creativity? And he says, how can we proclaim a moratorium on technology? It's actually what he's thinking about, like how he's gaming this out, right? How do you do that? It is impossible to destroy existing knowledge, impossible to paralyze man's inborn desire to learn and invent and innovate. Sounds good so far, okay, acknowledge that's there as a human thing. But then he says, in the final analysis, we find that technology is merely a tool created by man in pursuit of his infinite aspirations and is not the significant element invading the natural environment. So it's not technology itself that's the problem here. It says it is material growth itself that is the source of the conflict between man and nature. And there we go. So he acknowledges, this is where it gets dirty. He acknowledges that we have an inborn, innate potential and desire to strive out beyond ourselves, right? To go outside and discover. He acknowledges that. That's a good thing to acknowledge. But then he flips it and says we have to then find a way to harness that natural, innate, inborn desire and direct it to things that reduce the conflict between man and nature, which is material growth. So how do you generate incentives that apply our creative thought to activities economically that are going to, as an effect, reduce our carbon footprint, right? New technologies that will reduce our ability to sustain life, right? And how many people talk about innovation in solar panel technology or innovations in new biofuel techniques or burning food production for fuel, right? Instead of, 15,000 children a day die every day in Africa. How insane are we thinking about new technological innovations for burning fuel, burning food better, right? Or new ways of creating, like, the entire Montreal economy is the video game industry. Like, that's it. And, like, only pharmaceuticals and porn. Right? That's, like, become the core economic, building blocks. And, yeah, there's some innovation technologies that are disseminating these things. But at the end of the day, is it making us better or worse, right? Was that?
There's some transfer money in there too.
Right, yeah.
Just a little bit.
Yeah, turn oil revenues into porn. So anyway,
extortion revenues.
yeah. So, but that's how they get us, right? Divide to conquer. you want to control the system, like I was saying at the very beginning, when we're looking at that population demographic chart, the natural case of healthy human beings growing in quantity and quality, that's what healthy humans do. They always want to keep us in stasis. They want to keep us fighting each other. And so the best way to wire Canada under what Pierre Trudeau and Maurice Strong were able to do in their disastrous years in power was to create a situation where they handicapped Quebec's ability to have the type of industrial model that Daniel Johnson and de Gaulle and Lesage had been fighting for in the 60s. That was handicapped and destroyed after the martial law was declared. And a new technocracy was brought in that was based on just paying for bureaucracy. And then, because you're not producing and also you're sending your energy like to the US that you're selling for half or less the price than a Canadian would be paying for the same energy, you're destroying the revenue ability, you're destroying the culture, and then you create a dependency where all of a sudden where are we going to get what we need to sustain our giant bureaucracy? Alberta's got a lot of oil. So you then
Let's
create
get them to pay for it.
right? Equalization payments. And then you create animosity, right, between one nation that should have been maybe a nation that could have worked together and become something real. And instead now you got a whole nation of just parts that don't even have free trade amongst the provinces, or didn't up until maybe 2 seconds ago. And this is being undone for very dishonest reasons by Carney. But that was done specifically to keep us a very divided people that would not be able to do what the Americans have done at their best of times when they were acting like a real country. So, I'll end it there. There were other slides, but that's already way longer than I was expecting to go on for, and still have a bit of a dialogue process. Alex is here, Tom is here also, who knows things about the British Empire. China and these guys, bring them on. I'll get Tom first now.
Yeah, this is real quick. I just want to say that I only got caught the last 20 minutes of it. You put up the chart of all the new Malthusian, where we have, as opposed to 2 variables, we have 6.
Yeah.
And so, but we're still just pushing, as opposed to 1 slider to the right on the Excel spreadsheet, we push 5. It's the same thing. All they did was create a whole bunch of fake variables with a whole bunch of fake equations, and then they solved them using differential equations. And oh look, see, we got exactly what we expected.
Yeah.
What a shock. Here you go. And
Complexity, right? Because the complexity that they can process, your limited brain can't possibly manage. So
right. And so you're bamboozling people with even more bullshit. And guess what that looks like? The IPCC climate change temperature models. It's exactly the same.
Right.
And if you've ever this is where a guy like Ben Davison goes through it and just says, look, they gamed the math to game the argument, and then backfilled it, and then just flooded the zone with a whole bunch of propaganda.
Manufacturing.
That's literally it. And then they manufacture consent that way, and then it's just silly.
Yeah, Ben's a real scientist.
All right, I don't forget your question. Let me.
I got a couple of questions. Have you ever heard it said that the RCMP, their designation as a police force is above typical police forces? It's almost a military designation, and it is in fact kind of an occupation force for the country. And what does that mean in terms of our sovereignty, if that's the case?
Yeah, I wish I have a friend named Ryan Ray who did a whole thesis on this that I haven't properly studied. He can speak to that a lot. But yes, when it was created in the 1870s or so, it was really done as a force to protect the rail lines that were being brought in specifically to try to keep Canada from becoming part of the United States. So that was the motive behind the rail lines that the RCMP were created to defend. I don't fully know the ins and outs of but I think you're onto something.
One more quick question, which I've kind of asked you once before, and I forgive you for asking it again. There seems to be a real push. You didn't quite say it, but there's a religious element to the people who believe they can do these things with impunity. There's a lot of deception. It's not what it's presented to be.
Yeah.
Right?
Oh yeah.
And a lot of people in the conference yesterday were talking about getting back to Christianity, but from reading your books, I've seen that a lot of other themes get worked into even Christianity in different ways. And I remember your last lecture, all the different groups that sort of got involved. Where does somebody go to get a Christian or a philosophical or a spiritual background that kind of prepares them to deal, on a moral level with what we're walking into? Do you understand that question?
Yeah, I was thinking about, for me personally, I speak subjectively from what I found to be the most helpful for my heart, philosophically, was St. Augustine's on the free choice of the will as a Platonic dialogue on the nature of evil. So, if God is truly good and truly the best possible God you can imagine, right? And it's perfect. If evil exists, must God not have thus created evil, and thus must the cause not have some, or the effect not have some element of the cause flowing into it, and thus, can good create evil? Could the opposite principle create an opposite? And so he examines that and looks for its holes and looks for the nature of what is evil? Is it something built into the fabric of the universe, or is it something that's the effect of that's more the effect of a lack of understanding about our true nature, a lack of understanding about ourselves, about that creates a climate for perverted desires, distorted things we imagine, for ourselves and for others.
It's St. Augustine, did you say?
St. Augustine, yeah, 14th century philosopher, Platonist.
13th century?
No, 4th century, 4th century. Yeah. So I'd say that was a good one, and I try to look for, where does natural law in its most clear expression present itself at different times in different civilizational matrices that overcome evil and do good, and that tap into higher happiness and joy. And you'll find expressions of that in the best of the expressions of Renaissance traditions of India, of China, of the European Christian world, and it takes on different forms, but you'll find the same moral lessons that everyone's trying to sort of get at. That gives us a basis of respecting the differences of others, but also loving ourselves and our traditions, right? Without feeling insecure that this other tribe is going to hurt us because they call their God a different name. So people who have that kind of confidence, they tend to look at the best and most beautiful of others, knowing that we have this common aspiration for the good, the noble, divine justice, goodness for our kids. We build our language diplomatically around that kind of thing, and our trust forms around that. And if you don't have that, then even Christians can kill Christians with no end, like the 30 Years' War in Europe, annihilated 30 million Christians who slaughtered Christians. Again, we just lack that love and understanding of the other. So, but Augustine's for choice of the most pretty good.
I have some questions. When you started your lecture, you talked about a system that's been going on for several hundred years.
Centuries.
Several hundred years. Centuries. But your starting point was in the late 1800s, when the assessment was Jacob Rothschild and Roundtable.
Yep.
Are you able to go back a bit further?
Yeah.
That's why I'm ready.
Who said Babylon?
No, don't go to Babylon, just come back a little bit.
Babylon.
Read his books. His books go back further.
Yeah.
Well, I wrote a book called Revenge and Mystery Cults, Mystery Babylon and the Age of Aquarius, which is on that table over there. And one of the chapter 3 or 4 is on Milner's Roundtable as a Mithraic cult. As a Mithraic cult. And one of the dominant mystery cults of the Roman Empire. Every member of the Roman Legion and Praetorian Guard were initiates into a religion known as the cult of Mithra, the solar vectors. And it was brought in from Persia, revamped for the Roman psyche under Pompey. And it quickly became like the dominant oppositional force to Christianity later on. Christianity began to come onto the scene. And it interfaced with a couple of other big cults, like the cult of Isis, Serapis, which is sort of the Romanized version of the Isis cult of Egypt. That was sort of the sister version. And then a third one, Cybernetics, which is principally, they had a weird androgynous thing where to be a monk in the Sibyl Attis cult, you basically, if you were to be hierophant, you had to basically cut off your schlong and do a lot of drugs.
Trans movement.
Yeah.
A long time ago. Just checking.
A holy androgyny, like the thing.
That would explain the Club of Rome title then.
Huh?
Club of Rome could actually just be a nod.
That's where I'm thinking that I never got a full satisfactory answer for the Roman, but I think probably the reconstruction of the Roman Empire is how I'm thinking about it, yeah.
It walks like a duck.
Yeah. Yeah, that's like yeah, so I would just say that, and I'll get to and so when you know that the archetype that is being utilized by the Roundtable movement, and you read the writings of Leo Amory and Rhodes and Ruskin, the godfather of the whole thing, they're all idealizing the pre-Renaissance age, the great age before nation states, the great age before the Renaissance, before population began to spike, like we saw in those charts I showed at the beginning. That's the idealized romantic age they want to restore. That's why Ruskin called his movement the pre-Raphaelite society, the age before Raphael was doing the Sistine Chapel work, was the age we want to get back to. That's also the age of the Crusades. That's the age of the Roundtable of Arthurian legend myths that were recruiting for the Templars and the Kingdom of Jerusalem operation, right? That also has the Third Temple story to it too, because they're also obsessed with a weird Gnostic idea of reconstructing the Solomon Temple concept to fulfill their idea of prophecy for some reason. And when you look at it, when you know that there's a connection to this Templar occult organization that oversaw this bloodbath for centuries of the Crusades, then you could see, well, okay, what that was the cult of Mithra. It's the same organizational structure as the Mithra cult that went underground and manifested in a few ways, not the least of which was the Apostle Pillars and the Templars that did the thing. And it began with a ritual murder of overpopulated Normans. The first wave of the Crusades saw 40,000 idiot crusaders go and get slaughtered and die. And it did create that was seen by Bernard de Clairvaux and others as being a useful thing to get rid of excess eaters in Europe. Before the second wave that was more well organized was brought in to carry out the fight and create the kingdom for the first time around, right? In like 1097 or 1099. So yeah, I don't know if that kind of, but there's continuity. You can discover that in greater refinement and detail the more you pull on that thread.
Just a quick comment. As a homeschooling mom, I'm probably going to use all your books. Oh! Number 6 and 8, so maybe wait a couple years. I just follow up on the Rhodes Scholar conversation because I find it really interesting. We're from Prince Edward Island, and our chief medical health officer, Dr. Heather Morrison, is a Rhodes Scholar. And I guess my question is that maybe you can comment on this. It's very philosophical, so I appreciate your speculation on it. But like, these people, are they just all useful idiots? Like, what is the driving force? Because you can talk about evil and good. Like, you know that they know that we know it's wrong. Like, it's wrong that they're doing certain things. Like eugenics, for example, is obviously inherently evil. So what is able to convince these people that what they're doing has a driving purpose for good? Is there like a higher control or puppet person if they're ever doing it?
For the Rhodes Scholars, I don't think that they're all that high up. They're more. They were created to be a better organized mercenary class of managerial elite that wouldn't be disturbed or be conditioned in such a way through the experiences that would be given to them during their time in Oxford, such that their consciences wouldn't bother them when they need to carry out acts of brutality that might manifest in different ways at different times. Because that would have to be shut down as much as possible by awakening a sense of misanthropy, right? So whatever their experience was, the idea that human beings are some form of virus, were just disgusting, useless eaters, that had to be really cultivated, and something masquerading as the good would have to be replaced as an objective for them to have. That's why Cicero is called for a church of the British Empire, almost like a religious quality to it, right? During the 19th century, many of the civil servants of the British Empire were not following orders. There's many cases in India of British civil servants that didn't want to withhold available grains and wheat and other things for the Indians. They were disobeying what that was not tolerable. You couldn't tolerate that. Or like our Governor Frederick Seymour of BC was protecting the British Columbians who were leading the annexation movement to join Lincoln's Union. And they were getting protection by this guy who went on the reservation and said, no, I'm actually more sympathetic to this cause than for them to join the Confederation. And so he had to be eliminated. But that was a problem that they could only solve this way. And so I think the people who are generally given Rhodes scholarships doesn't make them a bad person necessarily, but it did mean that they have a psychological profile of ambition as a youth, right? A desire to succeed. That's useful as a first wave testing. If you're given more tests and you do the right thing, then you're going to be given that special all expenses paid experience, and you're going to be on a short list. And during that time, I'm sure they're tested in other ways, and some might be given their profile for having more or less control or influence over the thing that they'll be sent back to manage, the media or corporate or what Area 1, private equity that's controlling 200,000 acres of Canadian agriculture is run by a Rhodes Scholar, and they're kind of everywhere in blood for them. But I don't think they fully are privy to the higher planning by and large. I think they're more automatons. Yeah. I think they are kind of like knights in that sense, such as disposable knights that go off and do the real thing. Yeah. And ultimately, if they can, they get plans.
I think also might be a sense of that you're part of the elite group, and so you have a responsibility to take care of the whole world and the little population. So they have this kind of perhaps sense of not self-important.
Oh yes.
And in terms of purpose, and then the opportunity here now.
Yeah.
Right. But an example that came to mind about like the civil servant, ordinary civil servants in the empire, being shocked. The empire would be George Orwell. That he would have,
right,
produced in Burma.
Yeah. Yeah, he got totally sick of what he had to do. Yeah, that's a great example. Yeah, I mean,
in some of your works you've discussed Benjamin Franklin's attempt to convince Canada to join the American fight against Britain. Given that Alberta is contemplating independence, are there any lessons or interesting anecdotes you got from this area?
Yeah, well, I mean, try to take the lessons of. I would say the best thing for Canadians to hold in mind is why did we not succeed in our rebellions, our Republican rebellions, when they came so close, right? Like, we had a couple for like 2 seconds in the 1830s.
Riel.
Yeah, but then we had Riel. Right. Riel was another short-lived one. But I think the problem was we moved too quick and understood too little. So people wanted the effects of action now. And sometimes you do need that, right? But at the same measure, there were too many potheads who welcomed in insurrectionary agents provocateurs that undermined it from within, spies broke it up. I mean, the thing literally tripped on it. Like, it was like, spent 10 years building up the momentum and then like started the race, and the first step out of the gates, it sort of shoelace falls down. Because they didn't have the wisdom of Benjamin Franklin, who had a much greater understanding of good and evil, the nature of what the empire is. That was lacking at that time in the 1830s in Canada. So I think, people should definitely follow Ben Franklin's lead and work on how he did it. There's no easy answer. It's really a personal kind of quality of commitment to our own minds and hearts. Do you see? Oh, wait, I had to put that on there. Sorry. Yeah.
Is there an agency that exists above all the levels of agencies that you mentioned today that sort of control at an even higher level?
Yeah.
That I'm sure, but I mean the committee of 300, for example.
Yeah, I don't even know if
and they must change over time, right?
I'm the committee of 300 idea. There's a committee of 200 in Switzerland of 200 leading families that manage, or that did for centuries at least. I don't know what form it takes these days. That manage the sort of these governance structures. The committee of 300 story, I guess it was Bill Coleman, or I forget.
Yes, John Coleman.
John Coleman, yeah. It has some holes in it. He takes a quote from Walter of Athenhow talking about how 300 people control the world or whatever, And then builds up a model based upon that particular quote by Rathenow that I think has a lot of, it misses a lot of very powerful institutions that he should also be like looking at as it's not even part of his equation. I think things like these chivalric orders, these that were created at the First Crusade, like the Order of Malta, the Order of the Knights of St. John of Jerusalem, that every lieutenant governor has to be a member of, to be a lieutenant governor, up like since 1867. That's one thing you might want to look at. The different incarnations of the Order of Templars is another. Now, this is not necessarily the top thing. It's just that these are like more powerful and more important. But I don't think at the end of the day, it matters so much. Like, you don't necessarily need to know the intricacies of every different element of these agencies in order to create the types of situations that John F. Kennedy or any of the great minds who resisted the empire were able to create. Like, you have to be sensitive to it, but you don't have to like understand every aspect of it. Just it's kind of crazy.
Like my theory has always been, you just follow the money, right?
Yeah. I mean,
and that's your root.
Do you have a thought about the higher institutions transfer?
Are you asking me?
Yeah.
I think inevitably you have to be looking to the banking oligarchies because nothing happened without funding. And for example, I got into some discussions with people about the Zionist project, and then there's all kinds of Jews who are against it, and there are Jews who are for it. And then even if you go into Chabad, even there's differences, but somehow the people who are pushing all these ends, these imperial, anti-humanistic ends, end up getting all the attention, all the money, media support, political support. You don't get anywhere without politicians. You pay politicians, you have to have the money. And so, if you're not favorable to these ends, you get marginalized. And if we all in this room wanted to organize, set up some kind of a revolutionary movement, first problem we would have is money. And then somebody would say, like, okay, everybody paying $500 a year membership fee, and 9 out of 10 would be like, see. And so it's obviously coming from the source where money is not an issue, it's infinite.
Well, that's I think part of the thing is you've got these. So you have these continuity of families and bloodlines, but they also are maintained by their fondi, their trusts. So they're kind of born into these estates, and are thus kind of also held to maintain continuity of their dynasty by the estates that have certain managers that manage the estates, that manage the fondis, that then can use that for all sorts of operations off the books, off the typical balance sheets of nations that are one aspect of it too. But I think that a lot of these upper level families are kind of themselves sad. Like, it's sad to look at because they're babies born with all of this beautiful potential. And then I'm going to get Tom's thoughts on this too. And but they have the misfortune of being born into these like palatial sort of dynastic things, and they're early on, their whole life is programmed for them to have experiences that are designed to break them of their humanity at Eton College or some boarding school or whatever, and become the purveyors of the victimhood that they've experienced onto others. Right? And it's really sad that they do that to themselves. And ultimately can't last indefinitely, that type of unnatural behavior.
It's
a bit, yeah. But in the grand scheme of things, that's still just a flash in the pan. Yeah.
All I was going to say is that it comes to the point where you have to like decide who the current enemy is in the moment that you're actually fighting, because they're the ones that actually have the levers of power to actually do things. Alex's point about the banks is well understood. That's the choke point. Think about what they do, and then they always just create a choke point, put a toll booth on it, so that they can collect revenue, so that they can run the banks, so they can do their operations. And then they seed the zeitgeist with a bunch of crap that we all obsess over because we're trying to find the truth. And 90% of the information that's out there is managed by their very same intelligence apparatuses that are seeding malice and disinformation into the world. So there is no high table, folks. It's a metaphor. Okay? There is no 12 families that run the world and all we have to do is shoot them in the head and walk away. I wish it was that easy. It's not. It's a system that needs to be broken down. And when we understand the system and understand that also, so look at where the choke points are, because they create the choke points that are the things that create the tyranny at the economic level. So you blow apart as many of the choke points as possible. It makes it harder for them to manage the system. And it doesn't matter whether they were evil or they're vampires or they've been in charge for 2,000 years or think they're in charge for the last 2,000 years. That's where we have to generate our energy, because we spend all of our energy trying to argue amongst ourselves whether it's 13 families or 15 families. Dude, I've done libertarian politics. You want to argue over a comma or a semicolon? Great, you're over it, and I refer you back to the Monty Python, The Life of Brian. We were just talking about this downstairs, and it's like that great scene in The Life of Brian. Well, are you guys the people in front of Judea? Where the Judean people's front? Whatever happened to the popular front? Oh, he's over there. Splitter! That's what we're dealing with. And that's why the Romans won, that's why they were ineffectual. And go back, we can't be those people. And the question is, the inquisition behind the question is important. It spend no amount of time on it. You go, oh wow, that's interesting. If you come across the answer, great. But spend all of your energy trying to fight the thing that is right in front of you that you can see that you've identified. And to identify their system and then start attacking the choke points.
That's great.
Yeah.
Yeah. I forgot the ordering. You had a question. Great.
Well, sort of just, I was wondering if you could talk about, because you mentioned the Bank of Canada a number of times, what it used to be, 50s and 60s, and what it became in the 70s.
Look,
because a lot of people in the room probably don't know what it was.
So the Bank of Canada, at the best of times, the problem with the Bank of Canada is it was always Keynesian. So unlike the case of the U.S. experience, they had a tradition of national banking that at different moments was Hamiltonian, meaning it was based on a philosophy that you should always focus on building up an investment into free energy, like invest in such a way that you not only build things that will increase the productivity that extinguishes the debt you took in to build the thing, but then has additional qualitatively more production that allows you to then reinvest in even more, so the rate of change can increase ever more generation to generation. With the philosophy of Alexander Hamilton or Henry C. Carey or anybody in that tradition, it's very, very clear. That's where the greenbacks look at the philosophy that animated it was based on that. Whereas in the Bank of Canada, it could have been that. And Diefenbaker wanted to bring it into becoming a Lincoln-style greenback generating national bank.
Well, that's what he wanted. It was for fun.
It was a fun
interest-free for infrastructure.
Very, very low and you had a capital budget.
In the beginning of the Trudeau era, he sent all the money to the Bank of International Settlement.
Yeah. Yes.
And we lost that ability to get interest-free infrastructure money.
And what made that work really well is you had a concept of capital budgets, so you had the budgetary aspect of like the accounting that you would have to balance every quarter or annually, or taxpayer money and whatever revenues are accrued versus what expenses are. But then you had a capital budget that was a separate budget that would be allocated for building longer scale things. That would take yeah, exactly. And you would expect that those investments would be paid back until maybe 8 or 9 years. So you had more patience. Whereas in our day and age, post 1971, we lost that ability to think long term, right? And you had fixed exchange rates that allowed for knowing relatively what the stability of different values of currencies were going to be in a year, 2 years, or 5 years, or whatever. You had an ability to get parity pricing. So the markets could determine the prices of goods within limits, but not so high that the price would get so high that consumers couldn't buy them, or so low that the producer couldn't meet overhead costs by selling their product, right? So you had basic parity pricing. All these things were taken down at the same time that the Bank of Canada was transferred over. The Trudeau you know, its power as a gateway bank of international settlements for creating debt instead of building things that are real.
And the Bank of International Settlements is basically the central bank of the central bank.
Yes. Yeah. Oh, sorry. Yes.
So, have you with the stuff with the natives with the land that was just transferred there and stuff like that? Have you studied that a little bit? Because like, what's the play there from a higher up perspective?
It's hard for you alone not to be happy thing, right?
Dividing costs.
That's what I think it is. It looks like me.
Unceded.
It's unceded land.
But that's where there's.
The rest of Canada is all ceded by treaty.
Right.
No.
Well, how much? Okay. Well, what do you, Ben? Okay, you answer. Oh, Ben.
Well, you have to understand that First Nations don't have the right on governance. So when you transfer land over them, it's like the federal government that owns the property. So it's a way for the Canadian government to pick up some land without having to negotiate with the province.
Yeah.
And then to bring it to a higher level of supranational stuff that suddenly the UN would have their say on how these land would be. And all that, it's all made this thing.
They'll get tokenized and collateralized and put on their books for the European Central Bank.
That's correct. Yeah. So all that is to bring more asset to the federal government itself.
For free.
To be able, yeah, exactly. And as for the treaty only exists in the prairies, and because even Manitoba was founded by UDL without treaty. The treaty starts after what? No, their treaty on the north of Manitoba. And the treaty are a bit like as a farce. For the treaty are very short, so they're 2-3 pages long. They're very vague. And when you look at the result of the treaty, if I was Aboriginal myself, I would want them to be burned down because they created the most. Right now, the Aboriginal under treaties are life expectancy 20 years less than in other Canadian. They are the most criminalized, the most suicide, the most like anyway. So I believe that when I hear treaty, Quebec don't have any treaty, and when the First Nation wants more, you see all that happening. Like we treat them like anybody else that wants to take our land.
When we hear the Chinese are negotiating with bans over mineral access, does that mean they're negotiating with the bans, or does it mean what you're describing? They're actually negotiating with the federal government.
Well, because the federal gave the ban the veto. So again, they become like a proxy for the Fed. It's way easier sending a chief that is a dictator over his people than sending 10 bureaucrats from Ottawa to try to negotiate something.
And the treaties are set up.
Part of the problem there, I think, is that we've so abused the natives over generations as well. These reservations, like Ben was saying, the suicide rates are massive. Alcoholism, like crazy bad life expectancies, 20 years lower than average. 20 years lower. So they're rewarded to stay in their little concentration camp, but if they leave it, they lose so many privileges. So it's a real nefarious system.
They want to keep them dependent.
Very much so, yeah, and part of that too is like the quality of infrastructure, the lack of cleanly water. Like 1 out of 6 reservations don't even have safe drinking water. Even now, they've been requesting support, like to get access, like to actually have proper infrastructure, and they're not being given it. So they're being abused. They want to have some development. They have resources that could change their lives, but they're being told by these eco freaks that they're not allowed to develop those resources as well. So a lot of them actually want resources. Wishy, liberals are told in universities that the natives don't want technological growth, they don't want progress, that's the white man's thing. But if you actually talk to them, most of them really do want to develop. So they've been frustrated not being able to engage or get any support from Ottawa, and so they're like going to the world saying, hey, who can help us? And the Chinese have a lot of resources and means, and they're like, no one's on to you. Yeah, well,
But then again, the federal government would have to get involved on some level if it's actually federal land.
it's going to be complicated. That's a legal quagmire. Yeah.
Well, it's, the federal government's using the natives as a honey trap for China.
That's the other thing. Yeah.
What
does that
It
mean?
looks like to me.
What do you mean by that?
Yes.
So there's a seduction that's going on, right? Because one of the things that we're being given, especially in the conservative movement, is the China bad narrative. But when you actually go and do your digging, and when Matthew's earlier presentation, when he talked about groups within nations that are set up for trying to dismantle the true destiny of whatever the nation is deciding. We've had 3 major migrations that have made their way into Canada from China, and it just so happens that they correlate to sending 4.1 million persecuted from the CCP Chinese, but in all actuality, when you look into them and you follow their money and their what's been behind them, we just basically had Xi Jinping kick out our deep state, the British deep state out of China. So we got flooded 3 times in Canada. So the thing is that even when you look at what's supposedly representatives of the CCP government that are doing negotiations within Canada, and you actually find out that these proxies funnel in through areas of like Jack Ma in New York, right? Because they said the same thing that the Russians had happen with Lenin and the other guy. I'm forgetting, it was Trotsky, thank you.
Yeah.
So I think what we're getting here is that, first off, you should be fearing China, so that way you've got a big bad and you're not paying attention to the government in your own backyard that we need to, like Tom Long has said, go after the system that's right here. And then the other is if they can set it up to allow us to be upset with the natives and the natives to be mad at us, then all of a sudden we're scrapping with our fellow human beings when I should still be going after the people in the legislative building in Edmonton.
Right.
So that's my take on it.
Yeah, okay. Yeah. They want us fighting with each other.
Yes, sir, they do.
Different direction, and I stepped out for a few minutes, so I'm not sure if you touched on the Satanism aspect and the spiritual warfare aspect of what's...
Yeah, at the end of the day, yes, you can't ignore it, right? Like a lot of people want to have a clean geopolitical analysis that's, rooted in practical considerations, but you keep on slapping, like, in Tehran, they burned something like 6 different effigies to Baal as a message to the Epstein class that they see is we have an incentive structure that's been built in over generations in the West, rewarding pedophilia, rewarding people who do the most horrendous things to the most vulnerable people in our society. And those are the people who get rewarded and booted up into the higher echelons and higher clubs. And those who don't want to go along with it are hitting a glass ceiling. And so the fact that even the Iranians could see it and put out these pretty fun messages by printing these effigies in as a way to say screw you, like you guys are, you hypocrites. Enjoy it. I get a chuckle at that. But yeah, at the end of the day, you are dealing with something that is ancient and that is tied to, like when you read the writings of a lot of these Gnostics, like Charles Warren, who worked with Edward VII in excavating Solomon's temple and creating foundations of what became the state of Israel in the 1860s. Like these guys, they were the ones setting up the Palestinian Expedition Fund or Exploration Fund, right? And that's what set up like modern biblical archaeology comes out of their operation. This guy's writing his thoughts about what Solomon's temple was, and when you read what these higher echelon thinkers and doers believe is the temple, it's not what we see in the Bible. They believe it was they see it as a center of human sacrifice. So maybe they take an element of the Bible where Solomon starts worshiping, or paying homage to the various gods of the many wives that he took on for diplomatic reasons. But among those include Moloch and Baal. Yeah. Which means you're probably doing human sacrifice if you're doing that.
Matthew, isn't that the Bohemian Grove, the big owl?
It's Moloch, right?
That ain't Mithra.
No, exactly.
No, it's Moloch.
He's on the $1 bill. You fight it. And Moloch, yeah, and if you look at exactly, and these deities are very important to the governing class that has their own inner religious sort of thing. And And they want, when they talk about restoring Solomon's Temple in the mind of Charles Warren or Edward VII or Aleister Crowley, when they talk about it, they're thinking about a central hub of high priesthoods and global mystery cults that have a nerve center with that at its core, where humans were sacrificed, I suppose, should be again in their kind of revamped new religious order they want to kind of bring into being, maybe with alien gods, demons, that they can kind of weave into our narrative space that are, you know, crossover with AI bots that have a demonic life force of their own as self, right? So that's part of what we're seeing with Peter Thiel's narratives of the Antichrist. You see it even in our movies and our shows. There's a lot of propaganda to sort of get us to think that technology is demonic. That you know, that what we thought maybe was Jesus walking on water, the story of Muhammad, and the story of Buddha doing something supernatural. These are actually aliens that people didn't know what to talk about, and that's what actually these religions are. And it's always been aliens, and that's something that's been set up as well within the movies, within the political discourse, the philosophical discourse in our culture. And I think it's a big, disgusting magic trick to fool us into letting go of all of our traditions and adopting something that's more controlled by this magician class that is satanic at the end of the day. So yeah, that's my thought.
It's not just the Iranians that it's not just the Iranians that noticed. Putin actually made a statement about somewhat cryptically about the leaders in the West getting fat on human flesh, and he actually made an explicit statement about that. I don't remember.
No, I remember that.
He did say, yeah. I read that.
Yeah, that was one statement to the vampire ball river.
Yeah.
But there's other.
Yeah, I just have there was an article by Alexander Newman on Substack where he looks at ancient Iranian philosophy.
Yeah.
Right? And he talks about, like, you know, the Zoroastrians believe in two forces. The force of light, which is good, and the darkness. And the darkness was not just an absence of light, it was actually a force.
Yeah.
And that there's this battle, cosmic battle, which is good, which happens in the metaphysical sphere, but also in the realm of material. And the forces of light, they never use the means of darkness. You can't. So the force of darkness actually has an advantage in the material world, and it may look like the forces of light are defeated, but the force of light cannot use the means of darkness to build themselves. And it led me to think in terms of, you know, this is an ancient philosophy, pre-Islamic, that the old Ayatollah is now deceased. He issued a fatwa against nuclear weapons in 2003 because he said they're inherently evil. So you see that to him that was the dark means, even self-preservation. So I think that there's something deeper in Iran who sees this as a fight against this darkness in the world. So that's why they go and fight the Epstein.
And it sounds similar what you're saying to the argument Augustine makes against the Manichaeans, because the Manichaeans, the followers of money, which is a weird kind of syncretic, pseudo-Zoroastrian, Gnostic sect, right? That at its core believe that there are forces of that darkness and light have absolute substance that is equally counterbalanced, and to do homage to the good, you needed to also do homage to evil, or that if you wanted to generate something good, you had to do something evil so that the good could come into being, because without evil, the good has no meaning. As if the good's meaning came from doing evil. And Augustine was like, no, you can't assume, really prove that darkness has equal balance and substance to light. It sounds similar to what you were saying about
Zoroastrians believed this, but they felt that you had to be one or the other. You couldn't be both.
Oh,
so you had to. So, and if you started using the means of darkness, if you thought they were light,
no, all I'm saying is that
became dark.
Yeah, no, I agree with that.
You could not. And it may even mean that you're defeated in the present world, right? And you martyr or sacrifice or whatever, but you still have to adhere to the means of the light, but not do bad deeds to achieve good aim. It's just like the Kantian, right? In terms of the moving to the categorical imperative.
Yeah, I would say, again, it sounds very similar to what I was saying about Augustine with trees on free will. But I think unlike Kant, though, Augustine would say one should not be obliged to do their duty of the light, but should also love and want to do be the light and goodness, which is not, in the Kant's world, it's sort of like a duty thing that we naturally don't want to do the good, but we must do the good or else society practically will not work. So it's a more like formulaic thing, whereas in Augustine's world, it's all about free will, being ennobled to, awaken a higher sense of love, so that we're happier to even suffer physically, knowing that our soul is going to be healthier and we're going to be more at peace with ourselves than if we lived a happy, comfortable physical life, but at the cost of our conscience and our soul getting sicker and worse. That would be less enjoyable, right? So it sounds very similar again.
And John's imperative was that you can't do something bad for the greater good.
Oh yeah.
Because the means are really important.
Yeah, the means flow through the ends and the upper ends.
What about Saul?
That's the story. I don't know. I was there. Until the kids, I don't know.
He freely admitted it.
I guess redemption still. If you really, really did he want to get better? Did he get redeemed?
Well, that's the story.
Well, that's from the so in the story of that Charles Warren and these child sacrificers believe in, they're looking at this medieval document called the Testament of Solomon that acts like it's ancient, but it's not. It was created in the 12th century during the Crusades.
Yep. Yeah.
And in it, that's the story that was cooked up that Solomon had a demonic ring given to him that gave him control over the hordes and battles above that built the Solomon temple for him, his demons that obeyed his will. It's not really a thing in the Bible. It's just something that they believe in, and they probably wrote as like black magician and gossip, that they didn't sort of usually justify their own messed up political motive, acts on the earth. Yeah.
It's a magical power.
I think one, you and then you. How about that?
Do you have reason to believe that Russia and China have been able to resist a lot of the influence from this? Groups?
Yeah, but I mean, there's a fight. I think that China has done better than Russia so far at cutting off and battling out this evil thing inside of them. Russia's done well since Putin came in, but still has a longer way to go. So there's still a lot more influence that this thing has within Russia at the moment. But both of them have done, I think, still, I've seen more evidence that they've done better than us thus far. I don't know.
Is Trump doing better or is he failing?
Maybe see, huh? So far, I'm not super happy.
Either way, eh?
I'm not super happy so far with some of the decisions that are being made. I like Alex's diplomatic response that the cons seem to outweigh the benefits for the pros thus far in the calculus that's gotten us into the floor. Let's go with that. We'll see. Yes.
Going back to the issue of British control in Canada, where do you see the Commonwealth system following in? I mean, is it a beneficial thing if there's issues with control from the UK because they're not good? Notice a few of the Caribbean countries that have gotten out of it over the past.
Yeah, Jamaica got rid of their Privy Council, and that was good.
That's a good start.
Yeah. We should become a real. You can't be a real country if you're a Commonwealth, especially if you're part of the part of the Commonwealth that has the monarch, the crown as the official legal head of state, because that even comes with there's a lot of baggage that comes with that. It's not just a symbolic thing. Because that means that there's a governor general. That means around the governor general there's a bureaucracy. There's a privy council that's going to exert authority from the crown, which is the fount of all honors, that is the source of authority around which law should be obeyed in that system, in that British legal paradigm. It's not because we have inalienable rights or the consent of the governed or the will of the people or nothing like that determine the weight of law. There's the sitting crown or the sitting monarch will it to be so. That's why the crown, King Charles, can't have a driver's license. Because the purpose of driver's license, they came from his existence. So you drive, he's the only person you can't even kill and not facing repercussions. The reason why we would prosecute somebody for a murder is because of the crown. And it would be something different. Though it's also why it's interesting that Alexander oil has gotten.
Well, you got to remember the title of the country.
Yeah, exactly. So it's interesting that reality can still oppose itself, like into and break these absurd traditions.
They need a scapegoat.
Yeah, he's definitely a scapegoat.
But yeah, a Commonwealth's not a great way to organize a free society, I would say.
Can you comment a bit about Epstein, how that fits into this? That also started off with
Yeah, that's the truth.
Yeah, I mean, I think more important, more higher up in, because Epstein's a newer, useful tool within a very old complex that was used to carry out almost there's very little he didn't affect, shockingly enough, from investments in the Human Genome Project, and CRISPR technology, and transhumanist research, and neuroscience departments, and you name it. He's got 4chan, he's building up friggin' 4chan that sets the platform for QAnon. He's kind of everywhere. But I don't think he's a mover and a shaker, he's part of a complex like a mega group that's much bigger than him, which involves,
Worth entertainment.
That's it, yeah, exactly. Yeah. And so I think that more important would be people like the Bromptons, Brompton. Oh yeah, that's like Charles Brompton was the head of the mega group with Seagram. Well, he ran Seagram, yeah, but the whole Brompton dynasty going back to Samuel was made a knight in the order of Bath of the Queen back in the 1830s for his service to the empire, overseeing the growth of organized crime syndicates that had Mayor Lansky within it. That's more important because he was granted a dynasty, and even now, his great-great-grandson, Stephen Brompton, is the head of the Liberal Party Treasury. That's his current thing. He was the manager of Justin Trudeau, and his sister is the head of the Nixon cult. It's an offshoot of Scientology. And it's good things. Right. I mentioned Brookfield. That's the consequence of two Brompton operations that merged to create Brookfield, Raskin, and Edward in the 90s. That's the real power structure there, I think. Yeah.
Just a funny anecdote, Ronald Roney's house in Westmount was sold to him by Bronfman the day of the election, because when you become prime minister, the country take over your mortgage. So Bronfman sell the house for $4 million with a 4-year mortgage. So no. About the government.
It's a trivia, man. I love having your room these days.
Of course, there was market value.
It's interesting.
Is the Epstein feeling an awakening or a demoralization exercise? In other words, is it just another psyop to take the wind out of people's sails about everything that's going on?
I don't know. It's gotten people pretty fired up. So, on the one hand, the hunger the awareness of the nature and scope of the evil has been more acutely, it's been more clearly defined in a lot of people's minds who were more ambiguous on it beforehand. That's good. How do you think, Alex? Is it overall a net positive, the Epstein revelations and all that, or is it demoralizing side?
The more we know.
More we know. That's it. Yeah.
What'd you say?
Truth is not effective.
The more we know. It was there, we just didn't know about it.
Yeah.
I think if it's dehumanizing, ultimately that creates awakening, right?
Yeah.
So,
Exactly.
regardless, it's an awakening.
It comes with the
price. It's better.
Yeah, it hurts to look at the ugly, but it's useful to know it's there. This demon under the bed is there, so you don't just step out of the bed and get swiped by its claws.
But it also has this. I believe it has this impact that you want to encourage men to go to war, right? So that's the Iranians are coming, the Russians are coming. So you want men to go to war. Meanwhile, you brought I'm talking about for example of France. Meanwhile, you brought millions of Pakistanis, Indians, Syrians, Afghanis. And so you're saying, okay, German men go fight the Russians because they're coming from the place. And they're probably going to die. So your families, your wives and children are going to be in state care. we saw what the state kill looks like in the UK, where literally tens of thousands of English girls get raped and gang raped and killed in the UK. So knowing about all this is probably a huge, what do you call it, huge turnout to anybody whose imagination will in that kind of patriotism to say it doesn't have to go kill Russians.
Right. What am I defending here?
I can rely on my country to recognize my patriotism and take care of my family. I think that somewhere deep down, even if you don't think about this thing that personally you know, the trust is broken.
Right. That's very good. That's very good. So, yes.
So if you have the British deep state consolidating in the Canadian bureaucracy, at least for the better part of 50 years or longer, and you see Alberta with Little's no political representation of the West, how would we go about beginning to combat any of this without falling into the obvious pit traps that fall before?
Well, that is the thing we should be focusing on as a discussion, right? Is like, how does this work? Definitely.
There's a blueprint.
There's a blueprint. I mean, people have been thinking about this and organizing and chewing on this for a while. It seems like you've got some process. I'm from Montreal, right? So I'm not as privy as you guys are to the types of discussions and fights, but I know a lot of you guys are engaged. How would you respond to that question? Sorry.
Well, first and foremost is we do want to take a look at those who attempted to do this before. We have to understand where we failed. For lack of vision, the people perish. Yes. I'm going to encourage everybody that's here that is involved in looking at what Albertans are facing. Go and take a look, because one of the things that we don't get told is when you read the Declaration of Independence, there are 27 grievances that are offered as facts before they all decide to put that, the same line where they say, okay, well, we're either going to hang together or we're going to hang separately. But I would encourage you to look at what the grievances are, because if you actually, instead of His Majesty, which is what they use and they go along, go Ottawa and then read it. And you're going to find yourself going, we're going to take the necessary steps that this rule book is telling us that we need to take. My family did a look at the Value of Freedom document that came out, that the APP put out, just to kind of like show people that there are people thinking about this. There's building blocks to it. Brett Oland, who stepped out with the Bow Valley Credit Union, he helped write some of the financial side of like avenues that we could take as Albertans. So citizen action is going to be the first and foremost. I believe it was Matheson who said that like, the Republic requires a knowledgeable and moral people in order for it to succeed. So then that would incur upon me then to share with my fellow Albertans that then you want to have your moral aptitude sharp, as iron sharpens iron, so shall they. It's a metaphor. Not that I'm waving that banner. And then the other one is then, for lack of knowledge, my people were destroyed because they rejected knowledge. I reject them as priests before my house. So you have a responsibility to get that knowledge. And this is some of the things I'm mentioning are ways to do that. That's why we encouraged Matthew when we got woken up to this fight as a family all those years ago with the COVID debacle, and then realizing when I looked back at what the Americans, like we're calling them Americans, but they were British subjects like we were British subjects before they got the term Americans. And so they found themselves looking at this very infrastructure that you just asked the question about, that we've all been subjugated to, and it came to what Patrick Henry in his 1775 address to the Virginia Congress. And when you read that, he actually talks about all the supplications, all the different hoops that, as a people, they jumped through. And we're in that right now. Like, that's happening right now. That's what this referendum's going to be. We've got Elections Alberta trying to stop us at every step of the way. We've got a very neutral position in Danielle Smith, which is fine. That's where she said she would be on this matter. So I won't hold her to that. But these are the games within the games, and this is the structure that's going on around us. And when you take the forefathers, like the people south of the border, they're actually our brothers and sisters. Like, I mean that even from like the lineage, if we are willing to embrace that part of our history and who we are. So that's how I would like to encourage you, is that find out where your knowledge fits, let that Promethean inspiration rise, and then see how you can plug in, whether it's canvassing or podcasting, talking, reading, sharing, conversations, Cornerstone events, TBA, UCP, APP, like there's so many. I never sat on a board before, but now I'm on a board for an MLA, you know, and
my campus.
right. So it's just, and somewhere along the road, we're going to get punched in the face lots. And the Privy Council of Canada has already said it isn't happening. But the more of us that are standing side by side when that happens, we might find ourselves having to come to an independent Congress. And we're going to have to possibly say, we're not asking your permission.
Yes.
It might have to come to that. I don't know for sure. But we've got to start adopting the philosophy of planting trees whose shade we may not sit asunder. And if we can hold that for one another here now and hopefully forward, I'd rather take that puncher's chance than no chance.
If we don't do it now, we won't get another chance.
Yeah, that's quite thinking.
I should go right from Saskatchewan all the way over to BC. There's a lot of us in BC feel the same way.
Yeah, we're speaking at a We Unify event.
You guys are actually taking action.
Yeah.
All the pushback's coming out of Alberta too. And so this has to be protected, right? That in and of itself is a culture worth protecting.
Well, it's funny you say that because me and Macy spoke at a We Unify conference back in BC in 2023, and they were trying to build, they're doing it again in Kelowna this year and then Calgary later in October, but they were actually trying to build this kind of mentality and this civic engagement. Over like 75% of the speakers were from Alberta.
Yep.
All of BC and the encouragement, it's like they're Albertans physically going there and talking to them to get the movement, and same with Saskatchewan now, because you know, all the people that like to say, oh, Alberta is traitors to Canada, it's like they don't realize that all the other movements in other provinces, from Manitoba to Saskatchewan, it's Albertans that are saying, we want you with us, we know you're with us, because you're being subjugated same as we are.
Yeah.
So it's like, we really are in this together, it's just we got to play the long game, and the long game is putting our own oxygen mask on first before we can then lend a hand. So.
Well said. Yeah.
So,
Without Alberta, there would have not been a freedom convoy either. And
Yes.
Arlene made the point that it was only by going there that she realized that the Quebecois had there's a lot more that we have in common together, East Coast, West Coast, as human beings first, than we thought we did when we didn't have an opportunity to fight tyranny. Fighting tyranny brings out the best in everybody. And I think that what you just said is just so fantastic, that we have to awaken what is most human in everybody, and Alberta is take the lead in that fight.
Actually, Matt, it was Saskatchewan and Alberta. Chris Barber and Tamara Leach.
Oh,
Yeah, and you guys, yes, you're movers and shakers. You're ahead of us in SAS, but just so you know,
But, you
it
know,
was together.
We sent a lot of people out from Prince Rupert.
Oh, yeah.
There was like 60 people from Prince Rupert and all the way across.
And don't
We helped
forget
fund
about,
them.
and don't forget about Quebec holding the line.
Yeah.
Yeah.
It wasn't just one province.
We got a lot of brothers and sisters out there.
And the Yukon territories, and none of the large majority there are ready to separate. It's still not tiny.
One point I wanted to make on this is that I have a good friend who's Canadian, who's one of the Canadian, COVID Canadian expats. He's actually a good friend of mine. He's actually like in my house now. And he's from Toronto. And he's like, realize you get outside of Toronto, you get into the whole Toronto North, and they're all with you as well. There's a real, this is a trans-Canada issue. This is not just Alberta, just was that. He's been banging me on the head with that for years now, as this has been going. He was in Cornerstone with us, I'm sure if you remember, but very, very powerful human being. And he's like, yes, but this is important. So as you put your oxygen mask on, you reach out to the other provinces, you realize you have friends everywhere.
Absolutely.
Yes, we do. It's going to be important for how you build the funding networks, how you build the political power and everything else. It's really important.
And I think you'd find it in Northern Ontario as well.
That's with Northern Ontario. Yeah, that's exactly what I'm talking about.
It was interesting. Tom said as soon as you get out of Toronto, the folks are on the same page. I've been asking a question. I haven't heard an answer. Maybe folks know. What is it about cities that causes us to be so asleep? You get to the rural folks and they have much more common sense and their policy. Why is it that there's so much rot in our cities?
I'll keep it short. You can go to Substack and look at Cornucopia Economics. I just put it on Slack for Tom Malongo.
Okay.
I punched it out this morning so to be here for the chat. And if you've heard the mouse utopia concept over the last few years, that's it. What I called it as modern cities, the Maslowian collapse of the mouse utopia. And what's happening, very short version, it's different in rural, where kids learn things, but in Maslow's hierarchy, food, shelter, clothing, what happens in the cities is when you first start into a city bringing people together, you get that dynamicism like a small group like this, and it explodes. Once they sort of peak out like Detroit and Babylon and all these others, what happens is multiple generations in, just like in the Mouse Utopia with Vice, they forget about food, shelter, and clothing. Kids don't even know where their food comes from and other things. And so what happens is you've got generations of people that can't survive outside the system. And Maslow's hierarchy, everyone's worried about self-actualization, but if you don't build your base levels, which get eliminated multi-generational in a city, and then I've got something about in computers, if you've got diversity, a stress, you create heat when your systems are overloaded. And diversity, when you process through it and learn, can be a strength, but diversity itself is a stress on the system. And there's more to it, but shut up.
That's a good point that I would add the question of culture too, because the way I see sort of the development of the modern urban society is kind of like the way I look at the development of technologies. And the more you advance in technology, like if you get all of a sudden the technology of the written word, then the power that you formerly had of memory will tend to be diminished, right? And every time that the technology increases, there's a danger of losing powers of mind, especially for communications technologies. But does it have to be that way? Can you develop the power of the written word while at the same time increasing or maintaining the development of your memory at the same time? Why do you have to lose that? And I think the same thing for the urban setting. Like when you get a high energy density complex system together where many people can live at a high quality of life in a small center, it's true you don't have to physically do all of the labor on the plantation. You don't have to do you have to spend so much time doing those things. The danger is that you lose, like you said, the connection and the appreciation for all. You start taking for granted all of the things when you think cereal comes from the store, right? And you forget about the whole farming process and the fertilizer and everything else. So you need, I think, a culture that encourages a proper education so that people can awaken, even in an urban setting, an appreciation of the sacredness of that whole productive process that gives them access to this stuff. And a moral culture that teaches them that there's responsibilities as a citizen in an urban setting. And otherwise, the empire loves urban settings on their terms. If they control the standards of culture and Netflix, and they can monopolize the things that generate our aesthetical tastes and what we judge as being ugly and good. Well, that's a very easy way to control that culture in a small way, and people can get done really fast.
Well, they apply pressure to a system that's fragile, whereas if it's reinforced through what you talked about, it could survive centuries over and over. Yeah. But right now, look what they did to our kids during COVID and sexuality. They're fundamentally applying pressure to a system that needs what you talked about to stay strong, and they're pulling pillars out.
Right. Well, on the issue also of China, I was surprised, preparing my mind for the debate yesterday, I was looking into some of China's cultural policy as a government. I didn't realize until I did this research that the UK Department of Education, up until 2012, was controlling most of the textbooks of sociology and history that were being given then into China that seemed Chinese, but they were actually generated by the UK Department of Education. And when Xi Jinping came in, he banned them because there was sexual There's like the sexualization of children that was being introduced into the curriculum. All sorts of really immoral nudgings that we're seeing prevalent in our Western education. That was actually something that they extracted, so they intervened, and then banned like the feminization of men in music videos, and they passed laws where kids are not allowed to play more than 3 hours a week of like video games if they're under 17. So there's like all these things where there's evidence that the nation state can do things to fight back against this satanic hive that's taken over Hollywood and to create this.
But as to your point, our nation state is run by.
Well, that's the problem, right?
After, so.
That's the problem. I'm saying what's possible. I'm not saying like what I'm saying.
Yeah.
Oh, yes. Yeah.
So on the school thing, Robert Maxwell, UA, it's on all of that. We're through Alice can say Bill Browder, you want to take that one. But on the school thing, he bought up all of the school books publishers, he bought up so many peer-reviewed science things. So change science from being science to peer review, and it was to infiltrate.
Robert Maxwell.
Robert Maxwell. Yeah. And so if you look at and how it was created science in school. Sure. It's
So we are now at nearly 5 o'clock. I know, Ben, you had a thought in your head that you wanted to share for a while. Do you still want to do that now, or you want to go to Tom's dinner and talk right there?
I just want to comment on one thing. I've been living here for 20 years, coming from Quebec politics working in this province. And I'm still amazed how obedient Albertans are on Ottawa and how concentrated on Ottawa they are compared to Quebec. When you can live in Quebec for 20 years and never hear about Ottawa. If you're
it's not even a thought.
It's not even a thought. You don't think about what Ottawa decide, do. Now the Bill 101 that was predicted the French language. We're at 40 years of battle with the Supreme Court, 4 judgments against it so far, the 5th iteration. Basically, the Supreme Court don't have any more power than suggestion. So when they tell you that they struck your law, you can just change a couple of paragraphs, put it back at the ledge, and then they have to start the process. Right. So in Quebec, it's been under the process in 1979, and Bill 101 is still there, and Quebec has 38 of its own embassies around the world. Quebec has its own representative at the UN, not under Canada, under Quebec. Quebec operates sovereign. Collects its own tax in 1957, collects its own pensions in 1965. The Quebec pension plan is as an investment fund of $500 billion for 6 million insured. The Canadian pension plan has $700 billion for 22 million insured. So Quebec pension plan is 4 times more performant than the Canadian pension plan. Quebec owns more real estate in Canada than government in Alberta than government of Alberta. What? The Cross Iron Mill is owned by government of Quebec. The outlet in Edmonton, government of Quebec. So this is all Canadian because they have a rule to invest at least 40% of all the money they collect in Canada. So they only in Alberta they own for something like 15 billion of towers and shopping centers that you use every day. I don't know what we're waiting for.
You're still paying for Quebec.
Yeah.
No matter what.
So let's look at what they do and apply it with all culture. And who cares if they're working communists and whatever what they want? They are 4,000 kilometers away. I really don't care. All my families are even on here. I don't care what happens there. Because it's their choice. And, let's see how they are, and let's assert all right at our edge by a majority government that decides just to implement what Quebec does.
I'm not a fan of the DNA Act, the British North America Act, but at the same time it does give, as Ben was just saying, an immense amount of power to the provinces to control their own resources and destiny.
Look at Bennett, what Bennett did, what Lassage did, what Johnson did, what everybody did. So we have way more power than any American state, by the way. Way more. Every American state would love to have the power that can have to assert our independence.
Great point. Yeah, you can make deals with foreign governments. No, it's using stuff. Guys, this was fun. Everyone's get out.